This is the official beginning of the conference on the Undercommons and Destituent Power. My name is Nicole Siegel, and my fellow organizer here is
Kieran Ahrens.
We want just to welcome you very briefly before we hand the session over to the participants today. We want to thank our sponsors, who include most immediately the Institute for Advanced Study, who is hosting this webinar, the Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, the College Arts and Humanities Institute, and the Department of American Studies, especially the administrators who helped set all of this up. And we are grateful also for their patience in letting us try to plan this virtual version of the conference after the initial conference, which was scheduled for last March, was canceled by COVID. And we weren't sure if we were going to be able to make this happen at all. So we're thrilled to be here with you all, and also looking forward to a time when we can gather more of our formerly committed participants together and continue this conversation in real life. So thanks to everybody who's online with us today. Let me just tell you quickly how the session will go. We have 3 hours, so we're hoping to have a really deep and fascinating conversation. The panelists will start with their presentations, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. You participants are able to write your questions on the Q&A section of Zoom, and then the organizers will be collating those questions and will send them to the moderator, who will then group them and prioritize them and make decisions about how to ask who they are. For a little bit more of the substantive introduction of what we're doing, before I introduce the moderator, I'm going to turn the floor over to Kieran. Kieran, you're muted.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to welcome everyone as well to this 4-day mini conference on the Undercommons and Destituent Power. I'd like to welcome our speakers, our guests from around the world, and give a special shout out to everyone else on the organizing committee of the conference, which includes Mia Beach, Bella Bravo, Rose Zinnia, Ben Robinson, and J. Cameron Carter. This conference would not have been possible without the hard work of each of you, so thank you very much. This conference aims to collect and share what we've learned from the practices and forms of life that are already breaking free of the catastrophic politics of our time. We've imagined this as a forum through which to pool strategic and conceptual responses to the twin crises that have overturned the global order this year: the pandemic and the uprisings. While rooted in the urgencies of our present, we also feel it's important to draw upon deeper lineages of intellectual and political thought by weaving connections between the Black radical tradition and Italian autonomia, each of which signals a bifurcation and a rupture with established discourses rather than settled historical events or canons. It's clear that we're living through a period of civilizational decay. This decay has at least 2 faces. There's the demonstrable failure of ruling institutions to maintain order or credibility, in large part a function of their inability to sustain any vision of progress or redemption from the manifold catastrophes we face today. On the other hand, there's the historic routing and capture of the political subjectivities that once opposed these ruling institutions: the workers' movement, the subaltern, the New Left. Such double decay was destined to provoke confusion and misrecognition, to which the past 2 decades attest. From the confused efforts at constituent resurrection that bear the name of Podemos and Syriza, to the plethora of tragically botched lines of flight, from ISIS to Brexit, from Columbine to Sandy Hook, we're reminded of the madman's dictum that there are deeds, though done, that still require time to be seen and heard. The event of Western decline is still wandering, still awaiting an adequate reply. The hypothesis of a destituent power was first expressed in response to this same twofold implosion. In the crisis and discredit of the ruling institutions of Argentina in 2001, Colectivo Situaciones glimpsed the emergence of a new type of de-instituent revolt, one aimed at flattening sovereign representation without recreating it. A few years later, following the French banlieue riots of 2005, Mario Tronci observed that with the death of the workers' movement, a collapse of the Western subject more generally is already announced. In the horizonless violence of the riots by poor Black youth, Tronci glimpsed a crisis of the social subject more broadly, a crisis of subjectivity as a historical mode of presence and as the privileged site through which political action attains its form. This crisis was already underway beginning in the 1970s during the Autonomia movement, and is potentially nothing less, Tronci suggested, than the end of modern history as such. The destituent hypothesis is less a guarantee than a wager that looks like this. As the legitimacy of institutional representation continues to wither and unravel, a new approach to revolutionary non-sovereign community becomes thinkable. As the illegitimacy of both rulers as well as their formal opposition exhibits its emptiness ever more nakedly, a possibility opens up that Western modernity has tended everywhere to foreclose, not the return to archaic or pre-modern modes of subjectivity, nor the insistence on extending the shelf life of our tattered identities and social roles, each of them soaked in a violence and mutilation that cannot be easily washed away, but the possibility of elaborating a commons without institutional sanction, a fugitive subjectivity, a sociality or community that moves against the course of this world. As friends have observed, what's at issue then is nothing less than the repairing of our souls through the very act of repairing our world. The nature of such a revolution would no longer be political or cosmopolitan, but anthropological. With that, I'd like to hand over things to J. Kameron Carter, who'll be chairing our first panel, The Virus and the Uprisings.
I'm going to introduce Jay before we hand it on over to him.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kieran. So I want to do credit to my brilliant colleague, J. Kameron Carter, by telling you a little bit about him before he takes the floor. He is a professor of religious studies here at Indiana University, Bloomington. We successfully coaxed him away from Duke University. He teaches and writes about the structures of anti-Black racism, such as reason and other Enlightenment fundaments, or whiteness as political theology. And he draws on feminist, gender and queer theory and critical theory generally. I want to say that the folks I know who have been in his classes have said he's an incredible teacher. And as you will see today, he's a wonderful guide through complexity and a brilliant scholar in his own right. He's a hugely published scholar. His 2008 book, Race, A Theological Account, came out of Oxford. His next book will be coming out of Yale University Press next year, called The Religion of Whiteness on US Political Theology. Jay is also a book series editor for UNC Press and has co-edited several special issues of journals, including one issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly. He's a recipient of many fellowships, honors, and awards, including not one, but 2 National Humanities Center fellowships, a Luce Fellowship, fellowships from the NEH and the Franklin Humanities Institute. And he is also, in addition to all of that, a published poet. And he's a wonderful community builder. He's been a part of a large number of events on campus or on our virtual campus now with COVID strictures that have been involved in building the kinds of conversations that help us move towards the world we want. So Jay, thank you so much for agreeing to facilitate today. And with that, Kieran and I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and also to you, Kieran. had the joy and the pleasure of meeting Nicole and breaking bread and dining and having communion over some food together with Nicole, and it's been wonderful. But I haven't had the joy of meeting you face to face, Karen. So hopefully, once we can find a way to navigate this pandemic, we'll have an occasion to maybe get a beer or some wine or some victuals of some sort together. And I am, again, just generally very pleased and honored to be a moderator of this grand conversation around the virus and the uprising, the first panel of this broad 3-day conversation around destituent power, and 4-day conversation, thank you, Nicole, around destituent power and the Undercommons. There are many on the panel I don't know. There's some on the panel I do know, and that's for all of the panels across the several days. And as they say, I'm just glad to be in the proverbial room of this conversation. So without further ado, I just want to kind of just lay out how we're going to just unfold the panel this afternoon, this evening, and we'll head right into it. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists before we surrender the floor over to them to give their talk and their presentation. And then after we go through hearing the various talks, I believe that there are 5 of them, if I'm not mistaken, we will then have a kind of intra conversation among the panelists, an intra-panel conversation, and then please note whatever questions in the audience you may have and send them in to us. And my understanding is that I will have those questions sent over to me and can relay them to the panelists as such. So without further ado, I'm just going to begin by reading just a brief sentence or two about the first panelist and presenter, and we'll follow this pattern all the way through with our 5 panelists. My understanding is we're going to begin with Luhuna, and please forgive me if I pronounce anyone's name wrong. Feel free after I butcher it and accept my apologies, just to let me know and let the audience know the better and the correct pronunciation of your name if I get it off. But the first panelist is going to be Luhuna Carvalho. He's just submitted a PhD thesis on autonomia at the Center of Research on Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University in London. And he's been part of the RDA 69 Social Center in Lisbon, Portugal for, I believe, the last 10 years or so. And I want to surrender now to Luhuna to offer the first presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, hi everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the opportunity of being able to discuss all of this with you all. I'll start by presenting an ongoing process here in Lisbon that I've been involved in the last 6 months, which we could indeed call a mutual aid initiative. Afterwards, I'll address some of the questions by we I mean those involved in it, have in one way or another been forced to consider. Rather than present these events as candidates to a new repertoire of struggles or use them as mere examples of a larger and more abstract conceptual framework, of which this would be the corollary, the exercise I deem important to be done here consists in questioning what is the meaning of the fairly spontaneous gestures that emerged from the global pandemic and associated containment measures. I'll cut straight away to this description, and I'll try to make it as brief as possible. RDA 69, also known as RDA, is a social center close to downtown Lisbon. It is nested in the rapidly gentrifying neighborhood of Arroios, which, much like every other rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in the planet, mixes tourists, investment funds, young creative professionals, immigrants, bohemia, and a significant homeless population. RDA has a particular geographical location in the David and Goliath situation. It is located in a side street just behind the enormous building that houses the Bank of Portugal. Our front door faces the bank's back door. Although the nearby streets are packed with people and traffic, our street sees much less activity, giving us the opportunity to occupy the sidewalks and the pavements. Like plenty of other spaces, RDA became consistent as a project after the 2011-2012 cycle of struggles that collapsed the previous political composition of the left, at least here. It played an important role in the Portuguese anti-austerity movement of those years and has functioned for the past 10 years, performing, for better or worse, all the interesting and less interesting functions a social center of its sorts assumes. Amidst its activities, the most remarking and complex one consisted in a daily functioning canteen, which served around 80 cheap meals 6 days a week. People running the canteen were paid for their shifts, with increasingly organized methods of shift allocation, distribution of labor, and even informal forms of social security. On the one hand, this canteen provided an essential and consistent service and activity that sustained the social center. On the other hand, being the most time-intensive activity, it risked engulfing everything else, turning the social center into just a funky restaurant. When the first lockdown measures were enforced, attempts were made to keep the canteen functioning on a takeaway basis at cheaper prices. It soon became evident nobody was venturing out to eat. So we decided to give the food away for free as long as we could financially sustain it. We certainly had the structure and the know-how to cook for large numbers of people, so why not? The first week, shifts of 2 people cooked around 40 or 50 lunch meals. The second week, both the number of people and the number of meals increased, so 3 people cooked around 70, 80 meals. By the end of the first month, shifts of more than 5 people were cooking and distributing an average of 200 daily meals. When we announced this on social media, donations started pouring in, something that, unlike in the UK or the US, is totally unheard of. The movement has its own precarious economy and does not depend on donations. People using the canteen were varied. The neighborhood's homeless population, first and foremost, but also a lot of the elderly population, which lives either on the very cheap meals provided by some restaurants, as often their houses don't have kitchens, or by the state, but both options shut down in a rush because of the lockdown measures. Some workers use the canteen too, mostly delivery service operators. Also significant was the immigrant population that work in the restaurants, nearby restaurants, and after their closure, saw their meager resources quickly run out, being left homeless and without money to eat. As the weeks went by, 2 things occurred. One, the organization of the free canteen got smoother, more sophisticated, more efficient. Menus and groceries were planned in advance, recipes were streamlined and written down, shifts were decided weeks in advance. 2, the frontier between militants, canteen users, and the people who just showed up to help started to fade. Not only did some of the people we had met through the canteen start to help out cooking, packing, distributing, but the organization of the space began to service the implication of these new relations. People now had a place to charge their phones, wash their dry their clothes, etc. From this new sociality, which now greatly went beyond the members of the RDA collective, the plan came to squat a neighboring building, which would serve as a day center, a place where people could sit down to eat their meals, play some checkers, read the newspaper, etc. So Seara, the name we gave to this new place, was squatted in late April. During the next few days, the buildings next door were also squatted by people seeking housing. Seara would be open daily from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Besides, the utilities also hosted a lot of activities, including a live band that regularly streamed their performances online. At a certain point, almost an entire block in the center of Lisbon was squatted by mutual aid initiatives, while RDA and several other collectives operated canteens in nearby spots and elsewhere in the Lisbon metropolitan area, distributing more than 1,000 meals per day. But Seara's eviction came swiftly though. Faced with the impossibility of a speedy legal eviction, the owners, an international investment fund, hired a private security firm to operate the eviction. Confrontations between the bouncers, the squatters, and hundreds of people who showed up to show solidarity lasted the whole day, with protesters being able to retake the building for a few hours. Eventually, police came and chose a side, obviously not ours. The canteen lasted for 5 months until funds ran out and exhaustion finally won. Over 25,000 meals were served during this period. RDA still opens daily on a different basis. Food staples, cooking utensils, and stovetops are made available for people to use. Around 40 people show up every day, cooking, sharing tasks, some of them now sleeping in front of the social center. We'll see what comes out of this. I have some pictures to show you about all of this. Hope you can see them. So this is Lisbon. Wait a minute. Yeah, this is Lisbon. That this small thing over here is like the block that was all squatted. This all of it. This is Seara. This was like the building squatted next to it. This is RDA 69. This, you don't see much of it, is the Bank of Portugal. This is the front of RDA. This is set up for parties. It's not usually like this. This is a party that happened there. I wanted to show you like how the entrance is like right next to, like right in front of the Bank of Portugal. This is like the meals, the packed meals we used to distribute. These are like my beautiful comrades getting ready to give out the meals. This is the schedules to use the washing machine all throughout the weeks with some food supplies in the back. This is Seara. You don't see much of it, but there was like a building next to it that was also squat. People cleaning up the place when we squatted it. It's like some activities going on in the place. The band I told you about before. And finally, some scenes from the eviction. You can see that like over here, some of the people managed to regain entry to the building before the police showed up again. So I continue. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh shit! I lost the stuff that I was reading. Give me just 1 second. Yeah. Oh shit. Sorry. Not this one. What happened to it? Sorry, not used to presenting things on Zoom. Okay, here we are. Sorry about that. So the possibility I aim to discuss out of this experience is that gestures like this, with all their limits, contradictions, and doubts, replicate, mirror, continue, and reflect the sort of destituent gesture that occurs in the rebellions, insurrections, and revolts that we have been witnessing in the past decades. This might seem a boldish claim after all. No matter how interesting this all might appear, how much enthusiasm one might show in its description, it is still a very modest situation, lacking the apotheotic grandeur of several other recent events. Nevertheless, it is precisely in such a minor role that its relevance may reside. What is this destituent gesture that I claim was here reenacted? Not only, as stated in the text and announced this conference, a desertion from the institutions that rule social life, but also a process in which the apparatuses of control and command are deactivated, even if briefly. An example, how the experience of time and space is upset in the midst of a rebellion. The temporality of valorization, of production, reproduction, of a diffuse experience of social order, etc., simply seems to collapse. The same thing happens with the territorial organization that enforces the techniques, fluxes, and dispositions of command. The very experience of any riot is being where you're not supposed to, when you're not supposed to, doing things you're not supposed to. So insurrections suspend the sovereign organization of time and space. The claim of such a suspension is, however, immediately called into question when it became obvious that the contemporary pandemic lockdown measures also operate as suspension. This is obvious in the skewed experience of time that has emerged throughout this period. Time became but a mush, an indistinct mass of undifferentiated events. March turned into December. No one ever really knows what day of the week it is. Likewise with space. Houses and apartments have for the most part turned into sites of despair and isolation. The promise of the city, if it was still possible to claim such a promise of adventure and dérive in the contemporary metropolitan territories, showed itself for the fraud and scam it turned into. The permanent Sunday of the emptied metropolitan sprawl merely reveals the brutality and absurdity of cosmopolitan infrastructures. So distinction becomes necessary, one that allows us to distinguish between modalities of exception. On one hand, the sovereign exception that freezes or crystallizes time. On the other hand, a distinct exception that suspends it. So during lockdown, time and space aren't so much suspended, they are instead frozen or crystallized, meaning the apparatus of subjectivation that operate within the spheres of time and space are locked into place, and in their immobility, they become immediately perceptible. A frozen apparatus stops being command over subjectivation to become mere command. Now, if time and space are frozen, how can they ever be interrupted, suspended, or destituted? How do you stop and block a frozen metropolis? How do you shoot a frozen clock? To put it in somewhat more abstract terms, if the possibility of a political gesture is hinged on the unfolding of social relations throughout historical time, and on the relations of antagonism that unfold in the metropolitan organization of territory, then a crystallization of the forms of command at work in any of those dimensions seemingly forbids any political possibility, while ironically making the antagonism at work in them overtly evident. The dialectics inherent to such categories, time and space, are seemingly broken off, and a clear antagonism surfaces. However, if this problematizes politics, then all the better. Politics is always a very ambiguous term. In English, one has a politics, whereas in most Romance languages, like Portuguese or Italian, one does politics. Either the institutional management of social relations or the friend-enemy relation, opposed concepts which, however, are never fully distinguishable. And as much as the Schmittian definition of friendship always seems to be hinged on the institutions that any identity is able to produce, hence replicating within itself the rejected notions of politics as management. What this canteen and other projects like it aim to do, always in tentative terms, is to act an antagonism that exists beyond politics. That the gesture of demonetizing and decommodifying certain practices of care immediately proceeds to materialize the antagonism at its core through squatting and the construction of mutual aid networks illustrates how such gestures play out an antagonism that goes beyond politics. That the response to it was first and foremost non-state private violence also illustrates how these conflicts overcome the framework of conventional politics. So even if we're not talking about an insurrection, a riot, or anything remotely close, the same conceptual framework of destitution can still be applied in order to make sense of what happened. The question of violence is relevant here. One needn't rescue the Agamben-Benjamin discussion over the opposing violence to attest the existence of several different types and experience of violence. Through the revolts and insurrections of the last decade, one can witness a use of violence that, far from being played out in sovereign or military terms, aims to interrupt and depose commands, a violence that acts as an undoing. The question then is if one can think of a similar process playing out in the categories other than that of violence, meaning can we think of practices of mutual aid or care whose purpose rests on an undoing? By themselves, these categories aren't necessarily antagonistic and can easily assume the same constituent and sovereign overtones one associates with military violence. But the question here is different. Can one conceive of gestures of mutual aid and care that don't emerge as a new grounding or as the presupposition of an outside, but rather as forms of destitution? One can easily identify such forms within the ongoing insurrections, precisely as what happens behind the screen of violence, riot communism, looting, the popular canteens in Chile, etc. But one can also think of them without such violence, not because one must refuse violence, but because one doesn't want to depend on the possibility of being capable of enacting such violence, or on the sometimes despair wait for the insurrections to come. This would mean that they tend to think of something like a negative care, a care that doesn't presuppose the social and affective relations it creates, a care that dissolves rather than enforces those same relations, a destituent care that deserts normativity of social and affective relations. So here's the point I was looking to arrive at. The possibility of thinking a destituent power emerged through the insurrections of the past decade or so. However, this era of insurgency is also an era of counterinsurgency, of prevention of insurgency. Leaving all other COVID-19 debates aside, most of the lockdown measures being played out today, and I speak of Southern Europe, which is what I know best, are clearly experiments in counterinsurgency. The challenge then is to think destitution beyond the macro event, to think of a destitution that undoes command without depending, quote unquote, on historical events. I'm not claiming, of course, that the canteen or this canteen magically solved the dress, had any of these concerns at heart, or even thought of itself in terms anywhere close to this. Rather, that such process in a tentative, ephemeral, and imperfect form, one can find the possibility of a destituent aid of a negative care. So allow me to become clumsily programmatic. There were two moments of note in this experience. One, the collectivization of specific practices of aid and care within particular conditions, briefly dissolve social identities and the way these structures sovereign command. The sovereign ban, social debt, separation, whatever you might call it, briefly comes undone. This undoing quickly became explosive and expansive. It called upon hundreds of people, usually foreign or hostile to activism or militancy, and watched them assume unforeseeable antagonistic gestures. It's precisely what the rebellion is. To close off, every movement has to propose or similarly hinge on the proposal of a mediation between the moment of redemption, of revolution, and the actuality and materiality of historical conditions. Such mediation has been called politics, socialism, transition, reform, programmatism, etc. But there is a possibility that such mediation can assume a form that instead of articulating redemption and actuality, it seeks to slowly, steadily, and carefully untangle itself from such necessity. The global pandemic and the measures associated with it open the possibility of thinking an antagonistic gesture that goes beyond the tides of social movement and the moving sense of an eternal present. Thank you. This is it.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. I'm eager to hear the conversation around that when we get to the panel part of our conversation. For now, though, we want to move to the second presentation by the Avalanche collective, made up of Sonali Gupta, who is a doctoral student in biophysics at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and her colleague June, who's also a part of this collective as well. The collective as such is a research organ working across the boundaries of science, art, and revolt in order to raise questions about the future of life on Earth. Their presentation will delve a bit more into precisely these matters. And so with that said, I invite the Avalanche collective to present their presentation.
Hi, everybody. I just want to extend a big thank you to everyone who helped organize this panel. We're both really excited to be on it with everybody, and as well as to listen to the panels in the coming days.
I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. Okay.
Is it working?
It's working. Yeah, I think so.
Can people see our slides? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. The fugitivity of the virus. Coronavirus beyond good and evil. Viruses have been challenging our evolutionary fate since we crawled on this earth as single-celled organisms. The virus inserts its genes into the cell it infects, confusing the genealogy of every organism it encounters. It both ruptures the body to propagate its own spread and simultaneously encodes the body with the means for developing immunity. This ongoing dance is how viruses have driven the evolution of every species on Earth. The COVID-19 pandemic is a unique challenge to the form and function of our continued existence on this planet. COVID-19 has besieged the greater body of empire with as much tenacity as it attacks our lungs, hearts, and immune systems. Supply chains, the circulatory system of global trade and capitalism, continue to falter. The isolation, paranoia, and seemingly endless waiting that characterize the quarantine is reflective of a deep metabolic fatigue on a global scale. The virus festers in meat factories, cubicle farms, and jails, places that were already feeding off of the heinous expendability of life. In the face of this threat, can we come to understand the virus beyond good and evil? That is to say, in a manner that neither applauds the virus, as eugenicist or misanthropic approaches would do, nor remains paralyzed by fear, uncritically accepting state measures of control and austerity in hopes of a return to normal. The former attempts to dictate what gets to live, while the latter reflects a flawed disavowal of death. Taken together, these two poles effectively produce the logic of biopolitical governance, to make live and let die. We are made to live by adhering to the politics of health, where measures such as military enforced lockdowns and curfews, threats of mandatory vaccines, state fines imposed on social gatherings, and privacy encroaching measures such as contact tracing and location tracking are justified because they are believed to administer the well-being of a portion of the population. The rapid expansion of state control onto the biosphere is only countered by fanatics who indulge in COVID-19 denialism, conspiracy theories, anti-mask rhetoric, and even austerity measures that are, in essence, eugenicist as they choose to simply let people die. We seek a mode of existence that escapes biopolitics, one that confronts the facticity of the virus to manifest new forms of life, even in the midst of the sixth mass extinction event. Quarantined on a sinking ship. Deaths due to a virus are considered acceptable casualties as long as the crisis does not threaten the relations of global capital. Internationally coordinated state responses were not seen for viruses such as the dengue or yellow fever, even though they still cause mass deaths in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. In contrast, the COVID-19 pandemic spreads through China, US, Western Europe, as well as the rest of the world, those places that make up the core of the global capitalist empire. If we accept that COVID-19 was indeed caused by a spillover event due to habitat fragmentation resulting from the endless growth of capital, then we can say that the state-administered responses to the pandemic preserve rather than alter the conditions that got us into this situation. From this perspective, new methods of biopolitical control do not respond to the cause of the virus. They keep the species fixed in a state of decay. The loss of life due to COVID-19 is thus not a bug in the system, but a design feature. As COVID-19 reveals the infected core of an empire only capable of replicating sickness, a sweeping reorganization of life on a global scale becomes an absolute imperative. The question of revolution is now a matter of evolution. What are we to make of the fact that this pandemic arrived in the midst of an unprecedented wave of insurrections all over the globe? Is it possible to read the virus and the insurrections as two expressions of a unified impetus to escape the global empire of capital and economic governance? We make this comparison not just for the sake of analogy, but rather in a bid to access, as Idris Robertson writes, a hidden partisan knowledge to be uncovered surrounding the novel coronavirus pandemic that can also be exploited and weaponized against established power. It is not lost on us that biopolitical measures of control have failed to adequately address our collective situation, which continues to oscillate between the next phase of the pandemic and the next phase of the rebellion. However, we see these as a unified phenomena that operates according to its own logic and creates its own temporality. The machinations of virality provide us with figures of thought and movement to create new horizons in the face of an untenable situation on an increasingly uninhabitable planet.
Fugitive mechanics, the new information episteme. From epidemiological models to communications networks, systems of governance seek to map sources of information, constructing a genealogy of sorts, in order to constrain and direct the flow of information. In contrast, a viral mode of information propagation is one that is fundamentally unbounded and anti-genealogical. The source of an outbreak is often as unknown and as transient as a single cough. Without any central logic dictating its spread, the virus simply multiplies where it finds itself through any medium available, like wildfire. The virus cares not whether its host lives in a prison or in the White House, cutting across the classes and orders produced by the economy and maintained by the state. Existing sites of encounter, the workplace, the church, the nightclub, the courts, are all suspended as our relations come to be defined foremost by our relation to the virus. A vast rearrangement of resource and communications networks produces a different plane of connectivity, a rich medium for political contagion. In biological terms, viral information propagation proceeds through horizontal gene transfer. A virus will transport the genes of one of its hosts into another, allowing genes to be shared laterally across species, classes, orders, and even kingdoms. Thus, if species are individuated on the basis of their genetics, if DNA is a barcode for the biological subject, then the virus is nature's desubjectivizing machine. The synchronizers of ecosystems, viruses promote co-evolution by entangling the genetic trajectory of all forms of life they encounter. The virus is a stranger to the arboreal order given to life through genealogical categorization. Instead, the virus acts as a connective element that unravels this tree of life, encountering each body as if it exists on its own plane beyond the genus or the kingdom. Today, we see this very mode of virality begin to undo existing political genealogies. If revolutionary processes in the 20th century depended on specific constituted groups, whether that be the party, unions, or classes, to propagate a revolutionary impetus, today's uprisings seem to spread at an almost total disregard for any said constituted groupings. Revolts become the only connective element of an increasingly fragmented socius, calling into question pre-codified alliances and identities without ever congealing into a constituent body or coherent revolutionary subject that could be pointed to as responsible for the disarray. Virality designates a mode of contagion that destabilizes the way constituted groups interface with one another, confusing their position within the established order, which provides the grounds on which constituted powers take shape. Silent reconfigurations, memory, and escape. The virus contains a biological switch between two modes of viral replication, the lysogenic and the lytic, which correspond to two distinct temporalities and functions. The lysogenic consists of long, slow, invisible reconstitution, whereas the lytic phase is characterized by speed and sabotage. In the lysogenic mode, viral genes are integrated into the host genome. This video is supposed to play. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so these are genes that are inside the cell that get recopied within the cell. These are viral genes. And once they get transformed into viral DNA, that DNA is then imported into the nucleus, into our genome, and integrates into our DNA. And in this way sort of corrupts the language of embodied life. When the switch is then flipped from lysogenic to lytic, the host cell is turned into a biological factory for the exponential production of more viruses. And here you see a virus which has arrested the cell's endogenous machinery and is eventually breaking open the cell, rupturing from it, and basically creating these swarms that go on to attack new cells. So it is only at this point that the host becomes symptomatic. The virus makes itself visible only once the latent infection has progressed beyond its critical point. Just as a virus inserts its genes to transform the genome of the host, altering the body even as it continues its regular functions, so too a process of reconstitution precedes social rupture. If COVID-19 has a lysogenic phase of 2 to 14 days, the George Floyd rebellion had a lysogenic phase on the timescale of years. The lysogenic phase could be seen as a period of social peace, being asymptomatic with no visible displays of upheaval. These periods are an opportunity for a process of incubation in which partisans of the real have time to infect the social body with encoded sets of instructions and frameworks, so that when the lytic phase kicks in, always unpredictably, we have formulas to refer to as the physics that hold our world together break down. This knowledge was activated as neighborhood associations reconstituted themselves as eviction defense groups, and mutual aid groups mutated into million-dollar bail funds to support rebels in the months following the pandemic. Transforming a time of social peace into a lysogenic phase means looking for ways to unravel the existing functions of constituted groups and subjectivities, and instead turning them into vectors of escape. It is notable that viruses do not necessarily produce rupture to affect the functioning of the host. In fact, 8% of our DNA is composed of remnants of ancient viruses. These viral genetic sequences were initially thought to constitute junk DNA, since their expression was silent or noisy compared to genes which mapped onto a clear function within the cell. Now we know that these viral elements in our DNA are critical for basic functions such as pregnancy and immunity. When viral latency lasts long enough, it becomes embodied memory. A professor of philosophy lamented last year that not a single student in his freshman college course even remembered the Occupy movement. Without a knowledge of this history, he contended, no truly emancipatory horizon could be forged. A year later, we find teenagers and those fresh out of high school participate in some of the bravest and most innovative actions on the streets. We need not remember Occupy to know how to act when the time is right. Such a thread of embodied memory may seem silent, but will nevertheless express itself on its own timescale. We look to political genealogies for our history, when in fact history is made by the very elements that corrupt existing genealogies.
In the rapid transition from lysogenic to lytic, viral genes begin to systematically repurpose the machinery of the cell to exponentially produce new viruses which burst forth from the ruptured cell. When the social body ruptures, tactics, forms, and ideas self-replicate. Flows of information break through their cybernetic constraints, spilling onto the streets in the form of shattered windows and spray-painted prophecies, or the continuously mutating viromes of telegram groups. As city infrastructure is repurposed to construct barricades and consumer technologies are weaponized from leaf blowers to lasers, we see the body of civilization become the medium for mimesis, just as the cell becomes a site of pure propagation. As Fanon put it, we shall attempt to complete lysis of this morbid body. Viruses are the fastest evolving organisms on this planet. Their evolutionary speed can be attributed to their exponential replication. The more copies of a single entity, the more probable that it gains adaptive mutations. Each mutation adds to the possibility of evasion and makes viral spread difficult to control. For instance, the flu evolved so rapidly that some years the vaccine is only 10% effective. What is instructive here is the concept that redundancies within systems create new vectors of escape. The LAPD chief of police recently stated that a crowd of 10,000 is easier to control than 10 crowds of 1,000. These redundancies each retain the capacity to differentiate into new threats and spread thin the resources of the system to contain the evolving contagion. This dynamic was evident in the George Floyd rebellion, where social contagion on a national scale was disorienting for a coordinated federal response. In Minneapolis, the story goes that protesters were frequently warned by someone in the crowd, often after an explosive event, that the National Guard was just 10 minutes away. This empty warning was repeated so many times that it became a running joke. In reality, the National Guard would arrive as the rebellion began to peak in another city, leaving the Guard to clean up duty and whatever managerial tasks were left in the wake of chaos. The speed of lysis on a national scale reflected that crowds were able to observe, orient, decide, and act before the state apparatus, corporations, leftist organizations, and nonprofits, leaving them all to conduct autopsies of their lysed bodies, the charred remains of a precinct or a smashed and looted store.
It is notable that the switch between the lysogenic and lytic phase is not deterministic, but rather probabilistic. Viral genes form complex assemblages within the biological context of the host, such that various environmental stimuli, transient perturbations to the systems, and the ongoing background noise of living organisms all contribute to the probability that the threshold to the lytic phase is crossed. Similarly, there is no algorithm that prescribes the specific conditions that produce social rupture. There is no such thing as an engineered riot. The predictions and punditry surrounding possible reactions to a given election or the not guilty verdict of a murderous cop continuously fall flat because the rapid transition to rupture is subject only to the continuous compounding of internal stochasticities. The inherently statistical nature of this phase transition is a necessary feature of escape. If the process were deterministic, it could be precluded. Escape only occurs to the degree that it surprises itself.
The virus in the rebellion is isomorphic destituent phenomena. The advent of the coronavirus pandemic has solidified a destabilization of the categories that uphold the Western political order, and the state-administered and popular responses reflect this destabilization in their confusion. Right-wingers can appear to carry the torch of freedom as they protest against lockdowns, while the left clings to rules and regulations and reacts to the right wing. Though we might claim that the political poles seem to have momentarily been inverted, it is no surprise that neither pole nor any established political power has produced a response that addresses the root of our collective malady. Only the global wave of insurrections point to a horizon still vague, beyond new forms of economic control that hold all life on earth hostage. At the same time, these uprisings too seem to come crashing up against the limits of the political categories of the 20th century. Party, class, program, these components that characterize revolutionary movements of the past are largely absent from the unfolding unrest, leaving them subject to a confusion that parallels that taken up by the parties of order. This demands us to clarify new figures for our situation that trespass the logic of these political categories. Only by listening to what the virus says, its undoing of social genealogies, its latent reconfiguration of the social body, and the ancient speed at which it moves, can we begin to trace these out.
Viruses are the undercommons of the biological world. With no traceable origin, the virus is at once a prehistoric entity and also at the very frontier of evolution. Always a fugitive, the virus never belongs to the organism in which it resides, a stranger to the body at best, an infection at worst. The virus is fundamentally impure. It has been touched by everything and yet incorrigibly seeks further contact. Never static, the virus oscillates between the vast temporality of memory and the ultra-fast timescales of microbiological replication. Often it remains silent, but as Moten said of the duet Neutron, what is mistaken for silence becomes all at once transubstantial. Forever incomplete, continuously rewritten, the viral genome corrupts the very language of life, an electrified conduit between what was and what could yet be. A dazzling repertoire of geometries, the virus takes on innumerable forms, but cannot be called a life form. Always lesser than the fundamental unit of life, the virus exists in the liminal space between life and non-life, nothing but not absent, blood-stained, and precisely because of this, able to give birth.
Wow, fantastic. I wish you could jump into these conversations, but we got to go to the next one. I have so many. I'm almost ready to get into these conversations, but let's go to the third one. That was fantastic. Two wonderful conversations so far. We now go to Rodrigo Karmy Bolton, who teaches in the Center of Arab Studies and in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Chile. The problem of his research has been the issue of imagination in the Arab and Chilean revolts, and also imagination in classical Arab philosophy, including Averroes. He is the author of several published works, and rather than butcher the pronunciation of those works in Spanish, I will leave it at that and create and leave as much space as possible so that we can just hear the presentation of Rodrigo Karmy Bolton. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this workshop on Undercommons and Uprising. Thank you to Farrell for the organization and the colleagues for all your work. Second, I would like to thank also Geraldo Munez for helping me to translate my work to English. And third, I'd like to present some notes about the relationship between a theory of the destituent potentiality, as Giorgio Agamben has suggested, and a theory of the popular imagination, as I've been suggested in my last book called Intifada, that is on the about the Arab Spring. My contribution, I expect, is that the imagination is a destituent power, as the outside, like the outside of the Western humanism, or the outside of a non-sovereign experience, I would say. Maybe the contemporary coexistence between the virus and the revolts offers some possibilities to think the imaginal dimension of destituent potentiality. So I wrote a brief text called Imagination or Absolute Life. A virus and a revolt cross the world. A microorganism of genetic material that inserts itself into a cell and infects it. A popular eruption within a state that does not welcome it. The virus and revolt are actually two different names for the 21st century. On the one hand, we have cells invaded by the stranger who puts them under threat. On the other, we have weakened states traversed by foreigners that force their destitution and their inoperativity. Perhaps viruses and revolts are two names for the same problem, a problem that is fundamentally spectrological. As we know, a virus is not a cell, but a molecular assembly. It is something that is not alive to the extent that the cell, and only the cell, would say the biological knowledge, constitute its most primordial unit. Similarly, the revolt is neither a party or a regime, and as the virus, it is a popular assembly that cannot be defined clearly under the term politics, if we are to understand politics as institutional locus of sovereignty. Neither the virus nor the revolt becomes what they parasitize, since both are lack of being, a disjoint the regime of ontology, whether it is the sovereign primacy that articulates the autopoietic notion that defines the cells, like Maturana and Varela did, or the autarky that signifies the political regime, like Aristotle. Is a virus dead or alive? Is a revolt political or unpolitical? Let's say that the virus and the revolt proliferate today on the planet, became the same kind of spectrology in which the non-living and the living, the impolitical and the political experience, a point of intersection, as Furiesi, the young Italian Egyptologist, would claim in his Spartacus. A plot that mixes them to the point that the totality becomes spectral, or as I prefer, imaginal. For me, it's very important, the term imaginal. In this sense, the imaginal potentiality is far from being an exclusively animal faculty as Aristotle understood it, but rather the medium where all things experience the disjunction of being. Living and non-living things, the point of intersection between cosmology and anthropology, the intermezzo, medium between both polarities. In this sense, the imaginal is not reducible to information if we understand binary sequences as automated modulation since the cybernetic hypothesis is about how to regulate order. Imaginal does not claim cartographical space, but a topological one, following Heidegger's suggestion that imagination is without Hohmann, Heimat, the content force that destitutes every form and any order that claims sovereignty, including the form of governmentality by which Michel Foucault described the late modern and Christian configuration of power. The eruption of both the virus and the revolts are ways of embracing our existence in imagination. That is, the spectral dimension in which the living and the non-living, the human and the non-human converge. That is what the phenomenologist Henry Corbin claimed and the Suhrawardi's term of mundus imaginalis. Thus, the imagination leaves nothing in its place. Everything in it rises, floats, and initiates a process of becoming precisely because it is out of place, outside the general order of things. In other words, virus and revolts are two modes of the same imaginal intensity that go through this epoch without epoch. Two modes that instantaneous a rhythm of dissemination of all ontology in which the purity to which ethnic, linguistic, or cultural identities appeal becomes absurd, because in the imagination, all identity is transversed by the other of itself and interrupted by the sensitive roar that runs through it. Intensity, I think, is the name of all things, while potentiality is what escaped every dominant cartography. Neither in the anatomical scene nor in the form of the government, intensity crosses, bursts, reaches the table with invitation, without invitation, knocks on the door like a foreigner who takes us out of ourselves, embracing us in the common intensity that designates thought. That is the point, that thought. No? Indeed, this is the place of spectrology, as Jacques Derrida said sometime, also consistent with what Edward Said called mixture. It is a place without a place, a chorá, as Plato told us, that is a medium where every form becomes another from itself. This topology constitutes the strange place where the virus and the revolt becomes modes of imagination, as a singular crystallization, a sort of epiphany of the overflow that abysses and nevertheless offers polyform rhythms and multiple sequences. Virus and revolts are not the name that restore the classical metaphysical opposition between nature and culture, but two ways to describe the infinite intensity of imagination in which the non-living and the living mercilessly cross each other. Furiesi named double Sophia to the interruption of mythical eternity in historical contingency, the advent of potentiality in its singular crystallization. Double Sophia becomes the privileged term, maybe, to designate not only the revolt, but the constitutive disjunction of everything that exists. Overwhelmed doctors, overwhelmed politicians, overwhelmed times. Viruses are the immanent revolt at the cellular level, while the revolt is the immanent virus of all political institutions, capable of forcing the mutation of things at a molecular level beyond any planning. The imaginal in its becoming is nothing more than what we could call experience, a medial disjunction in which something like the living can take place. The imaginal condition is life, or more precisely, absolute life, because it can't be reduced to any form, since it can only make possible every kind of form. Maybe we also could think imagination as absolute life, just like the concept of magma in Castoriadis' philosophy, or an mundus imaginalis, as Corban thought. That's why virus and revolts are two kinds of monsters that arise against the unity, because they bring to us the outside of existence, the little window that could be open when we are confined by the pandemic, or the soft gesture of a revolt that destitute the closure of every political order. Destitution is not destruction. It is to give a new possibility to the world, a new use of the body, as Giorgio Agamben says, while destruction is the violence of a revolutionary vanguard. Destitution is the potentiality of whatever being's imagination that turn off the operativity of every system and also making impossible any vanguard. And that's why destitution is not a power, but a potentiality. A power implies the capture of imagination in some order, what Sigmund Freud called illusion. Potentiality instead release new forms of life. That's why I think as absolute life, it is not conceived as a system, a totality of articulate parts, but the eternal diffraction regarding to life within itself. Hence, there are not simply viruses or revolts. Today, we are bearing witnesses to two modes of imagination that move beyond the censura of nature or culture to allow for an experience that names the medial region that reminds us that we are neither simply alive nor dead. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I got to hold back. These questions of mine are building up here, but I got to hold back. We're going to go to the next presentation. Thank you for that wonderful, thought-provoking presentation. So many things, the imaginal. Okay, fourth presenter is Geraldo Munez. Geraldo Munez teaches at the Modern Languages Department at Lehigh University. He's the author of Alberto Lamar Sveya. I'm going to mess this up, so I'm not even going to try and pronounce the rest of it. If you like, you can say a bit more about it. You also note here in this very short bio that you provided me that you've worked on other projects, special issues around dealing with Giorgio Agamben and Italian theory, and some even more recent work. Your work on the whole and in the main covers contemporary Spanish politics for French journalistic outlets as well. So with that said, I want to cede the floor and the platform to you to offer your presentation, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing.
Thank you, Jay. And of course, first of all, I want to extend my thanks to the organizers of this conference, and especially for everyone who has presented today as well, and everyone who's watching. My short intervention is titled for the moment, Tailoring the Invisible, but I'm not too sure about that title yet. And I think I will start by saying that an important problem of departure is the problem of reality, and it's interesting that reality could be also theorized, in the Western tradition as the problem of the constitution of things, as a juridical problem, as a problem of res, right? In the Roman law tradition, which is something that I would like to take up in future developments of this text. But in any case, I would say that to contest then reality and open an entry into our epoch demands that we raise a question regarding the location of power today. In a certain way, this seems banal. It is, but at the same time, it's one of the conditions that lead to many deadlocks and impasse today. And we know that the failure of producing, I would say, a strong hermeneutics about reality has moral and political compensations that, for the most part, have become obsolete in our present. So as we think the stakes here are high, since the failure of crafting a description of the efficacy of power takes away even the possibility of having a different failure. That's the first thing that I would say. Pushing thought forward today means that there are no guarantees. I think Kameron mentioned it in the introduction, but it's more about failing at least otherwise, right? So given this claim, I propose the following question of departure. Can thought tease out new routes beyond the common tracks that today, I think, for the most part, are represented by a strong emphasis on biopolitical suture of life in the wake of the principle of general equivalence? And I want to pursue this question by making a comment and an exploration of some of the theses proposed by Chilean philosopher, also professor at Michigan University, Sergio Villalobos-Ruminot, in his recent book published a few months ago, titled Asedios al Fascismo, which I take it to be, along with Rodrigo Karmy's also book about the Chilean revolt, El Porvenir se hereda, or The Future is Inherited, is one of the most important theoretical treatments of the Chilean October Revolt of 2019. Asedios al Fascismo, which can roughly be translated as putting fascism under siege, offers us a geometry of the critical metaphysical apparatuses of current domination. And by doing so, it confronts the inheritance of the modern political architectonics in order to advance a transformative thinking. That is, to dispute the metapolitical ground of politics and thus opening something like an eccentric void in which no technique can capture. So I would like to suggest that the destituent gesture is not just another political concept, no? It's not just another idea, right? As it was common about a decade ago when there was a lot of talking about the communist idea, right? But it's rather, first and foremost, a autopoietical gesture against and very much counter to the surface metaphysical structuration of the social in the wake of the end of sovereignty and the crisis of the nation state, for instance. So we can claim that there are two vectors that traverse our epoch. There's fascism and there's revolt. Of course, we should be mindful here about the term fascism, and not only because of its historical specificity or about its conceptual stratification, but rather because political liberalism doesn't cease talking about the production of fascism and reducing it to pathologies of sovereignty, imperialist patterns, or generic legal exceptionalism. These hermeneutical designs, I would claim, no longer account for where fascism stands today. Villalobos tells us that the ongoing fascism is neither an accident nor a deviation, but is rather a generic condition of democracy. And it constitutes the very dispensation of its principles, which is why, says Villalobos, democracy today doesn't allow any reformist program counter to its molecular and anthropological acceleration. As an integral form of capitalist development, fascism then is the diagram that organizes the epoch. It's the epoch of inversion, which Jacques Camatz, already in the 1970s, famously called the thesis of the anthropomorphization hypothesis in the regime of real subsumption. So the theory of the anthropologization of capital implies a new performance and thus a compensatory biopolitics that increases the regulation of our life, right? And it includes practices of reproduction and procreation at the very core. In other words, fascism today means any tendency towards the hegemony of form over the temporality of the existent. This is why machination, right, or this biopolitical maximization seeks time and again to limit the kinetic energy of the potentiality of the singular's life or ethos. And in fact, we can say that our epoch in a way does not move, right? By this, we mean that we are in a process of the total domestication in relation to the outside. So the fact that total mobilization does not cease, right? Paradoxically, to organize the life of the world seems to confirm this hypothesis, since the infinite mobilization is what flattens out the experiential dimension of the constitution of reality by creating a new static politics. The apparatus of the current mobilization is identified by Villalobos, he says, as a logic of optimization, which I take it to be a sort of capillary regulation of logics of effects, management of turbulence, and trade-off mechanisms that arrange aleatory precautions. You know, in American constitutionalism, this is very much in place, for instance. Hence, we must be clear that we're far from the modern total mobilization, right? That was spearheaded in the this epoch by the figures of the soldier and the worker, right? The great theory of Junger. And in contrast, in the cybernetic epoch, mobilization is ordered by a rationality that attenuates conflict in line with the management of social reproduction. So when in the 1940s, the great philosopher of anthropology or philosophical anthropology, Helmut Plessner, explained that fascism in Germany was a byproduct of the asymmetrical divergence between institutional representation and the will of the people, the constituent pole. Today we can say that this is no longer the case, right? In contrast to the German polar night, the ongoing process of absolutization is today constitutive of the very conditions of equilibrium of state politics optimization. So this rationality that we can broadly define as cybernetical or cybernetics is a flexible integrated science of life and world, of governmentality and legal production of forms. In other words, the new cybernetic configuration builds a specific type of geometry of power. And it's a geometry that seeks to contain the event by all means possible. So let me now move to the second vector, the revolt. At some point in half of the book, Villalobos says that the revolt is an instance, he says, of the anarchy of the senses. And we see in the revolt, a revolt against the prison of the I, of the subject, and its melodramatic forms, in an attempt to invent new forms of encounter and affection through bodies that recuperate their potentiality. There is a vitalist dimension here, but more importantly, I would like to suggest that this dimension of the event transfigures the very nihilism of the epoch rooted in life. Another collective, you know, the famous collective Tikkun, at the beginning of the millennium, back in 2001, was writing suggesting then that the two emergent historical parties would be precisely the party of cybernetics, which they call also empire, and the party of the event. And the event reopens the question of the epoch through a new stylization of life. You know, this is a category that I'm interested in other investigations, the category of style. This is Tikkun in Introduction of Civil War in Thesis 9, right? They say that each sequence of play is bordered on either edge by an event, and that the event disorders the play between form of life and introduces a fold within it, suspends past determinations and inaugurates new ones through which they must be interpreted. And so the distance required, says Tikkun, the distance required for the description of such a form of life is precisely the distance of enmity, you know, the distance between enemies or hostilities. There's a lot to unpack here, condensed in this in Thesis 9, but it suffices to say, I think, that the event solicits, first of all, a distance away from enmity for a new transfiguration of politics as such. And I would put emphasis here on the question of play, you know, the importance of how the play elements renders flexible the relation between form and event, between form and exteriority in time, right? I think this is important because if we slightly shift the relation between play and politics, then we perhaps can imagine something else than politics as war, right? Which was the critique that Huizinga, the famous scholar of play, did at the end of his book against Carl Schmitt, which is at times forgotten. The eruption of the event introduces a distance against every politics grounded in the subject. Therefore, the revolt as an event does not possess a political technology, as it was the case during revolutionary tradition in the 20th century, Leninism in particular, but it does offer the possibility of positing a new discriminatory principle to ground its possible breakthrough. First of all, I think this means that revolt are waged at the level of experience. I think Rodrigo touched on this as well. And this experiential dimension liberates styles that have been segregated in the prison of form or concepts. Secondly, I would say that the revolts are also against the metropolis. Given that the metropolis today stands as a topoi for the reproduction of life without world, it's a metaphysical apparatus too. It's not just a question of Democrats voting in cities in the United States. Thirdly, the exposure to an event puts the classical definition of the militant or militancy in crisis, since they're only truth in the process of the encounter and not preconceived causes to defend. And this discriminatory principle for revolts shouldn't be prescriptive, right? But it does invite us to establish at least thin distinction between politics of teleology and a new politics of means. As we know, for the most of the modern period, the logic of revolt or revolution sought to resolve the problem of the event by means of a movement, and a movement was a synthetic prosthetic apparatus or invention that seek to gather dispersion into a form. So for this reason, something else must be rethought and reimagined in line of the ongoing fragmentation that we see, right? I find useful Rodrigo Karmy's notion of the rhythm or rhythmicity, right? That pushes for a disjointed tonality of liberated flows against any reordering of subjective aggregated political will. And the exhaustion of the political subject frees existence in order to unlock the epoch. Existence here means violence against form. It means violence capable of separating life and world, ingredients of affection, and the limits in which we use things. If we understand that in this way, then we can say that the destituent gesture is a realist practice, not a messianic practice. Here I would take a little bit of distance from Agamben. It's a realist practice that has its only exception in relation to production, which is the limit in which use becomes abuse in the world. So what is at stake in this, and I'm coming to the end, what is at stake in this existential breakthrough? Of course, it doesn't mean that we want to return to the existential humanism of the 20th century, by no means. I think that the existential position introduces violence against the biopolitical closure of the world, and existence elicits the question about singular form in the infinite, which cannot be administered through any command, and definitely not through any articulation of hegemony. Existence is on the side of metaphysical anarchy over the democratic aspiration of isonomic mediation, which today I think is coterminous with the principle of cost-benefit rationality, or with the principle of general equivalence, right? Which Nancy says that is the last name of nihilism today. Finally, I will close with this. I think that there are three types of revolts that we can sketch out. There are probably more, but I would just introduce a brief typology of revolt in order to favor the last one, the third one. And this typology, one could say, is the way in which revolt can be measured to the event, to the force of this event as exteriority. And the first one is, I think, a revolt that continues to, and again, these are not just descriptions of actual existing revolt, but just also hermeneutical forms in which people or scholars have tend to think about revolts. There is a revolt that continues to be thought as a logic of occupation, no? In 2010, it was occupying a plaza or a space, right? And generating conditions of obligatory participation, right? As Raúl Sibeki famously called it in his book, Dispersing Power. But in 2020, some have suggested that the revolts are about occupying a whole city, right? Well, this seems to me to recast and re-inseminate the modernist Leninist technique by other means. And there is a revolt then that seeks to dissolve politics as such, right? Inhabiting then a threshold at the end of the world, right? A sort of intensification of a part, of a singularization, right? A partisan politics, which we can also call an archipolitics. I think certain scholars of Afro-pessimism, we recently had a very productive exchange with Frank Wilderson, fits in this category. And finally, there is a way of understanding the revolt as experiential, and that is by insisting on the outside, and an outside that allows for a distance between existence and a world, and between form and event. This new experiential expression of revolts suspends all representation of demands against the objectivation of the metropolitan social containment. One could say that the expressionist style of recent revolts based on experience, right, have yet to find an adequate political form. Hence, the transfigured dimension of this experiential politics has the capacity, I think, to revert forms to a more flexible, free-playing, and elastic in each life. And I don't know how much time, I think I lost track of time. I do have a little bit more, but I don't know. I don't want to cross too much of the time allocated so that we can have the conversation. But I can just leave it here if I'm already at the limit.
I was so enwrapped in your talk, I lost track of time as well. My sense is that we're probably we're trying to keep it around 20 minutes. I think this would be a good place to break, unless you just sort of feel compelled that you want to like kind of make one concluding point. If I'll leave it up to you in that regard, or else if this is a good break point, we'll go ahead and break here and pick it up in the panel exchange. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think we can just leave it here, because my last paragraph was a recapitulation and suggestion that going back to the book, that is putting fascism under siege, right? This word siege is interesting, right? It could be interpreted as occupying a zone of the enemy, or it could also be a way of exodus, And I was going just to suggest that I think it's interesting in light of the experiential dimension to suggest the second option. But anyways, I will leave it here.
And is this a book that you've worked on, or is this you're drawing on another book on this fascism?
No, this is the book that Sergio Villalobos Ruminot wrote about the Chilean revolt, and I just wanted to use some of his.
Indeed, yeah. Well, I tell you what, can we just hear more of that in the Q&A? I'm eager to hear a lot more about that. And for now, we'll just go to the next panelist, and it's already clear we're going to have a great intro panel discussion, let alone taking up Q&A from others as well. As we move now to I think that was the fourth. We're going to go to our last presentation by Megan Moore. Megan is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Minnesota. Megan's work explores the relationship between settler colonialism and real estate finance. focusing on derivative technology as a divinatory force and questions of ontological fragmentation emerging around technology in the 21st century. For her presentation now, I'm sorry, there's one more. My friend Dylan just texted me, said, what about me? So this is the next to the last. Sorry about that, Dylan. Let me continue with this last sentence. In this panel, Megan will be presenting more personal writing from her experience with chronic illness and the possibility of healing in common. This is the penultimate presentation, panelist presentation. And then of course, we'll go to Dylan's presentation, Dylan Rodriguez. But Megan, please make your presentation. We're eager to hear it.
Hi, thank you. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'm going to open with a poem. A quick content warning. It's about chronic pain. It's not super graphic, but just in case. Sorry. Okay. Yellow was the color that came. She asked me to relax. It took some time to stop gripping, pin down, to support me in holding the space between sensation and reaction. Needles released arthritic tension. Rushes of pain emerged. I followed them, accepting pain's presence, accepting myself, tracked the contours as they revealed another layer of depth, as they revealed me, showing how pain connects to how I hold the world and conceive of limits until it dissipated into calm. She then asked me, what is there now? What does calm feel like? Does it have a color, a smell? I don't reject her questions. Reassociation is surprising. Present with my knees, pondering. They were the first to develop arthritis at 15 for just one winter. Before the return in every joint, 10 years later. Knees foreshadowed much of my life. A note of confusion, mother shame and shameful mothering congealed in me. Neglect breeding neglect. I accepted this and held on to my deep desire to learn change. Then the color came. Yellow, the softest spring yellow, flashed so suddenly and bright, absorbed me, filled the calm. She asked me to delight in it, a new pleasure. I've been on the journey of healing the complex kind of chronic pain that comes with long-term illness and inflammation for several years now. In this talk, I want to give you an image of what it means to fugitively plan from the time of illness. I'm using my own body and experience as an example, precisely because my body and many bodies with experiences similar to mine, the immunocompromised, are about to become the justification for new forms of state control and surveillance. Just as the Avalanche Collective has offered an alternative to liberal fears around the virus, I want to offer an alternative to the liberal savior narratives, the attempts to save people like me, which will justify emerging forms of state control in the coming years. I'm going to talk about a form of care, which is something I want you all to think with me about, as both an alternative to the dynamics of saviorism and to its opposite genocidal impulses of disassociating from what the existence of coronavirus means for people with chronic illnesses, elders, and people whose access to ability aids have been severely repressed in the pandemic. I argue that the struggle to value these lives in the pandemic is fundamentally related to anti-Black violence and the spirit of suspicion around abilities, which has grown out of anti-Blackness. I'm personally committed to struggles related to transforming my own inheritance, and thus my thought is deeply ingrained in the dynamics of Turtle Island, North America. But I'm excited to compare all our experiences and think across the fragmentations and holes emerging in global capitalism. In her work toward a crip of color critique, Gina Kim brings up an alternative to disability justice narratives, which focus on individual abilities and freedoms, offering that rather than looking for evidence of self-ownership or resistance, we need to read or look for relations of social, material, and prosthetic support. That is, the various means through which lives are enriched, enabled, and made possible. Similarly, in her work on debility, Jasbir Puar shows that disability is not a fixed state or attribute, but exists in relation to assemblages of capacity and debility, modulated across historical time, geopolitical space, institutional mandates, and discursive regimes. Disability is, in a sense, a paradox. It's a way of representing as sovereign individuals, people whose lives and abilities call into question the very concept of a constituted individual who can be thought of as separate or separable from their particular relatedness to the world. But this is the problem with and paradox of constituent power as I understand it. From colonization, we have a certain definition of what it means to be human, relying on the continual reinvention of concepts of race and the doctrine of discovery, which upheld the right of the colonizer to colonize non-Christian peoples, deeming land that was not related to through constituted systems of relating as terra nullius, empty. Colonization and early capitalism brought many experiments with property rights, two of which, the chattelization of bodies in chattel slavery and the chattelization of land and the establishment of the first foreclosure system, invented to steal tribal land in the New England area, have been expanded on and exported to the world. It's in this sense that property is metaphysical, that it defines the edges of a particular world, a particular perspective and relation to the world of law, which can only relate through the constituent relation, which identifies known parts in order to constitute a unified whole. Legal historian Cheryl Harris writes that because whiteness came to be defined and redefined in relation to who could own property in the US, that we can almost think whiteness as property. Whiteness is the relation to the world, which emerged with the idea that freedom could be achieved through property regimes, that one's relation to inheritance, ancestry, or place did not matter if one learned to relate through property and the commodity relation. It was the grouping together of people with disparate backgrounds, but the same tone of epidermis, who fit ongoing redefinitions of proper relation to land, corresponding to colonial concepts of race that got us whiteness. It is in this sense that today whiteness haunts a certain kind of relation. Whiteness dissociates from ancestral time. A sense of time is continuous, any sense of relatedness prior to the constituted individual's birth. Akila Mimbe provocatively writes that although Blackness as a term emerged with early capitalism, referring to enslaved peoples of Africa, that today, precisely because now all people who participate in the internet have their lives and data commodified, not exactly of their own choosing, that this widespread commodification of every aspect of our lives and our lives themselves is part of the becoming Black of the world. And of course, I wouldn't identify myself with Blackness, but what I have learned from Mbembe's work is how to think about the shadow side of the commodity relation of whiteness, which I call the carceral relation. It was Marx who talked about the commodity fetish, that through colonizing our exchanges, the commodity relation colors a perspective of the world, and that within capitalist societies, People come to perceive value almost entirely through the commodity form. This perception of the world is, I think, a fundamental part of understanding how constituent power moves today. It can't stop colonizing. We see this in the endless wars of the US and in the endless financialization of every corner of the earth. Constituent power's shadow side is incarceration. That with each legal constitution, each form brought into recognition by the law, also provides new ways of perceiving dissent, perceiving what is not legal, perceiving the criminal. On one end of the machine, the commodity relation calls you into relatedness with capitalism. And from the other end, the carceral relation punishes, exiles, destitutes, kills, and lets die everyone who cannot fit their life into a legal form of relating, or anyone who rebels. Disability is the legal recognition of people whose abilities make the dance between the commodity relation and the carceral relation a dubious affair. And it is why I and many other chronically ill people whose abilities change learn how to wear the identity of disability as a strategic mask in the world, with the knowledge that oppression comes from this absurd choice between capitalism or die, which relies on a concept of a constituted individual whose body can consistently produce labor value, and that the failure of my body to live up to that is part of a bigger problem of what capitalism and constituent forms of governance have forced us to disassociate from, to not see our relatedness, that we can never be separate, that your unfreedom is tied up in mine, that allowing me an identity to be recognized by the state is not the same as care, it's not what I need. In the US medical system, there's been chatter around the growing number of chronic illnesses in the 21st century. Right now, the CDC estimates that 45% of US citizens have at least one chronic illness. The words immunocompromised and chronic illness have likely been playing in the background of your life in 2020 because they're one of the only ways that medical professionals have been permitted to describe risk in the pandemic. Back in the spring, the FDA created Operation Quack Hack, that's its real name, to stop the spread of disinformation about how to treat and understand COVID-19, suing and sending cease and desist letters to anyone using the language of cure, treatment, or prevention in relation to coronavirus. But of course, at this point, we've seen Trump himself administered vitamins C, D, and zinc in order to prepare his body for the possibility of COVID. And studies are beginning to emerge which complicate an idea of risk. So within this terrain of confusion, how do we think risk such that it opens up new possibilities of changing with the virus rather than new forms of state capture? Autoimmunity is a word that began being used in the mid-20th century, but it took some time for the concept and a pathological understanding of autoimmunity to gain popular use in biomedicine. This is because autoimmunity brought the concept of a constituted individual from 19th and 20th century medical thought into question. This idea of a separation between body environment, body mind, inside outside. Warwick Anderson, in his book about the history of autoimmunity, talks about how autoimmunity blurs the line and raises questions about what even constitutes disease. When does imbalance or deviation mean disease? And further, it raises questions about destruction. What does it mean for the body to destroy itself? What is this kind of latent destructive capacity? How does it transform a biomedical understanding of body's relatedness to the world? What is a body? What is a we? To live with an autoimmune disease in the US is to be shuffled between worlds held up by varying concepts of the individual and their corresponding realities. I've been forced to develop a particular perspective in this shuffle in order to find dignity. The handful of rheumatologists I've seen have told me that my body is malfunctioning, will malfunction for the rest of my life, and that science has no idea why. Each symptom receives a referral to a different specialist, the body examined as fragmented organs by fragmented perspectives. It's only been offhand that the word remission or a mention of diet helping with symptom management were mentioned. This is because the biomedical world, the medical industrial machine, is propped up by laws based on the concept of a constituted individual, by studies conducted through the scientific method, and proper paths of treatment determined in negotiations between pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies. All knowledge and advice is generated through these channels and is highly policed to prevent lawsuits. A treatment that results in remission cannot be scientifically proven. It's not the same in each body and each individual with my disease, and thus remission remains a random occurrence. In this system, the only treatment for my disease is that of drugs which repress the entire immune system of the body, making one very susceptible to contracting viruses and infections. More recently, a study has been popularized that shows that people with recurring childhood trauma or neglect are 70% more likely to develop an autoimmune disease and 100% more likely to develop rheumatic autoimmune diseases. But beyond pointing to this statistic, medical institutions don't really have the techniques or the relationship to the world or to patients to really ask or dig into what this means. How did we get this sick? How do we get well? The forms of traditional medicine, which ask these questions and which sought spiritual and relational guidance to learn change, lie on the other side of the carceral relation. They were outlawed in the ongoing colonial war against indigenous knowledge, which helped establish biomedical institutions. In traditional Chinese medicine, and I'm going to refer to Brant Stickley's work here. In traditional Chinese medicine, organs have channel systems that move throughout the body, each representing a different register of time and a different world. Stickley writes that one must interact with each channel appropriately according to its temporicity. All reference to time in classical Chinese medicine texts are highly symbolic. Flow and movement are intrinsic to temporicity. Blockages in the flow of meridians is thus stopped time. Movement precedes time and implies direction. Direction precedes space. In traditional Chinese medicine, it's understood that we inherit our life energy through the kidneys. They're the root organ. The kidneys are also responsible for bone strength, joint lubrication, hair, mineral imbalance, our energy levels, knee pain. So often trauma shows up in the joints. And this is the uncanniness of illness, that when you feel like an experience steals your energy, it actually does. And that the illnesses that emerge from trauma land in the body in ways that reflect that particular trauma. The temporicity aspect of chronic illness is something which the mask of disability doesn't quite capture, and which I've tried to explain to people to varying degrees of success. For me, it has felt like a blockage, like seeing the world and being totally out of joint with it, with feeling the temporal blockage between yourself and others. People rarely pause to think with the time of illness, with how to collaborate with you across these registers and blockages. That kind of collaboration requires others to think with their time, their trauma, their body, with a deep relatedness that we are rarely encouraged to sense or perceive. Part of the misery of chronic illness for me is being forced into negotiations with chronological time, institutional time, labor time, identity time, which expect people to be the same. The way I've learned to manage illness and to find some degree of healing is a different temporal path. developing a respect for the temporicity which helps each organ express itself. Kidney time is right now. It's the few hours before dinner. For me, it's the time of warm tea, meditation, and kidney herbs. Autoimmunity makes my body feel just a little more sensitive to getting caught in the world, to getting stuck in the institutional gaze, the perspective which assumes that all bodies are constituted equally. It was exciting when I learned this, that my body was not randomly attacking itself, but rather reacting to the form of life I was forced into, which disassociated from any expression of my life in a way that allowed for flow, nourishment, vitality. When I overexert, I experience inflammation in the corresponding organ system. When I experience overwhelming emotions, I experience corresponding illness. Healing has been about developing a devotion and daily practice around calling each organ back into a relation of flow. Learning how to prop myself up strategically when I'm weak. Learning care, not as a destination to a life without disease, as I will never be without this bodily impulse toward hypersensitivity, but as a path which allows me to learn how to change my inheritance of trauma and its settler colonial dissociative relation to place. This is why I think that the calls from Indigenous feminists to return to right relationship, what Kim Tallbear calls caretaking relations, is related to building destituent power. It is not abstract, but begins now. It's a possibility in our bodies and relations now. It is the promise of healing, but it requires perspective. The perspective I'm learning to develop is one in between institution and my own bodily sense. How does the institution see me? What limits the doctor's perspective? What are they allowed to see, to say, to know? You can learn to read between the lines this way, to compare what they can and can't see to your bodily sense, to learn how to get needs met, to build fugitive knowledge toward fugitive planning out of the time of illness, and the undercommons which escapes the institutional gaze, not by reacting to it directly and getting more caught in it, but by seeing from the enemy's point of view and learning how to plan through what is not seen, not said, not recognized. Care in this sense is not empathy. I'm very wary of highly empathetic people because they often lose themselves in the pain of others. And when your pain is horrifying and they see this, they often respond with pity. And when you're very sick, pity feels like poison. It feels like someone finally seeing the temporal difference between your worlds, only to affirm the distance. Care is different. It feels like someone seeing the temporal difference and learning how to strategically hold themselves, approach you, and build relation through it. Care is seeing your unfreedom in mine, seeing your healing in mine. It is not unity. It is only a partial connection, a partial relation. It thinks with difference and does not force you to be the same. This care is what I now think of as comradely love, the possibility of destituent power, of healing in common. In the time of widespread chronic illness today, I'm worried about the co-optation of the uprising back into the commodity form of widespread disassociation, which always reflects in bodies. But the time of illness also presents an enormous opportunity. It is in the time of illness that the contours of inherited pain, inherited trauma, reveal themselves so precisely. I think we can see this in COVID. And an approach which doesn't resist the state, but sees this other vision, this perspective developed in between institution and sense, which can think about healing and a healing path that is too obscure for state capture, that holds the possibility of destituting our dependence on the carceral relation, rather than destituting ourselves in the constituent relation, is what I'm excited about as I see it emerge. and as I see millions express the desire for change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely wonderful. Again, many questions are swirling through my head after this presentation. Thank you so much, Megan. Just wonderful. Let's get to our final panelist, and then from there we'll begin this intra-panel conversation. Again, I'm still getting myself together after that last presentation. Thank you again. Dylan Rodriguez is going to be our final panelist. Dylan is an activist, scholar, abolitionist teacher. He was named to the inaugural class of Freedom Scholars in 2020 and is currently president of the American Studies Association this year, that is 2020-2021. He has worked as a professor at the University of California, Riverside since 2001. And I'm eager and I'm very pleased and excited to be able to introduce Dylan, someone I consider a good friend. Dylan, take it over from here.
All right, mic check. I sound okay?
Yeah, you sound great. Sound great.
All right, beautiful. I was hoping when Jay said that Megan was last, I could skip my presentation and go right into the seminar part. So thanks for having me, you all. I want to express my appreciation to Nicole for inviting me to the party. Most importantly, I really appreciate it. And thanks to Hugh for pulling us together in our pre-conversations. I'm honored to be with my co-panelists, most of whom I'm meeting for the first time. And thanks to my good friend, comrade, fellow troublemaker, Jay, for being here. So just a preface to my comments, my book, White Reconstruction, just came out last month. And I've been working on a short book-length follow-up to White Reconstruction that is simply and goofily titled White Reconstruction 2. that title could change. But what I'd like to do today is read from a couple sections of the introductory and penultimate chapters of the book that is in progress. And I'm going to interrupt my reading a couple times with some semi-extemporaneous reflections on what I think is the abolitionist moment that this gathering inhabits. And I'm also notoriously a fast talker, and I saw in the chat that we need to speak slow. So I'm going to do my best to do that while also trying to stay within my allotted time, because I know the conversations are always what everyone looks forward to. So I'll go to my text first. Suspicion and accusation are a minimal disturbance to a force that spills endless violations of spirit, memory, and flesh. There's no state of exception, just a grinding normal that concedes reform in the demand, inventing and refurbishing a civilizational imperative. White supremacy is but a minimal term for this extended order of things. Its dangers become refined and acute under changing protocols of recruitment, retention, expulsion, elimination. The white nationalist imperative surges and retreats. Contrary to liberal narratives of the reaction's periodic and exceptional rise on waves of mobilized xenophobia, misogyny, and populist racialized hate, the white national form is constantly in evidence everywhere, shaping the multiculturalist diversity initiatives that re-embody the inheritances of 1619 and Manifest Destiny alike. The depth of this condition reaches beneath the semi-literacies of phobia and violent entitlement, because it's enmeshed in the nervous system of inheritors, as well as the disinherited and the owned. It is epigenetic, socially induced, though no less physiologically bound in the epidermis itself. My own conspiratorial pseudoscience here is a late response to their stubborn eugenics, but they cannot acknowledge this linkage. Doing so would reveal their allegiance to the sociologics of eugenics, even as they selectively condemn its scientific fraudulence. Depart from the text for a second here, and I hope you'll allow me to offer some reflections on the moment we're in before I return to the prepared text. I want to share with you all in full transparency that I am attempting to inhabit the moment that this gathering is in, and the moment that the planet's in, as one who tries to work in the abolitionist tradition of Black radicalism and revolutionary struggle, which is to say that I try to approach this condition and the collective praxis, collective creativity that emerges from it as a student, as an apprentice, and also with a deep sense of humility. At the same time that I advance that framing of how I enter this moment, how I inherit this moment, I want to also say that I am not forgoing the urgent impulse that I think I share with some of you, that I also must constantly honor, which is toward proliferating whatever expertise and wisdom I may inherit or otherwise access, and to weaponize that impulse toward insurgent, collective, creative forms of power. It's a dangerous but necessary organizing practice that is at once experimental and speculative. I think that's how this particular moment is being inhabited broadly by people in insurrection. And it's also, I think, part of what animates this gathering, this particular gathering. So this moment teaches and reminds us yet again that the very things that contemporary 21st century abolitionists are addressing, which is principally policing, criminalization, and especially incarceration, that these things are central to everything. Policing, criminalization, incarceration are not outcomes of capitalism or racial capitalism or colonial power. They are those things. That is perhaps one of the most important insights that this moment is urging people to embrace. Also, the fact that the US is a state of perpetual war, and that this war is not only global, it is not only hemispheric, but it is also what you might call domestic. That is a condition of perpetual domestic war. Put another way, I'll just reflect back to you what I learned from some people in the late 1990s when I was kind of being trained in abolitionist thought, work, creativity, and praxis. And what I learned from people, and these are people who were formerly incarcerated, some people who are currently incarcerated, one of whom still is incarcerated, and people who are former unrecognized US political prisoners, who unapologetically and rigorously framed the idea that the United States carceral regime, what at the time we were calling the prison industrial complex, is a form of genocide, right? And this was something that these collaborators and mentors articulated, and which I then inherited as the condition that shapes the abolitionist imperative. It's what urges the weaponization that I'm talking about toward insurgency, abolitionist insurgency. Putting it yet another way, I think the entire field of abolitionist praxis in the contemporary moment is necessarily and directly formed in the intellectual and activist labor of formerly and currently incarcerated organizers, activists, and revolutionaries. So the primary pedagogical message from this archive is that the only ethical response, for that matter, the only logical response to the condition that I'm arguing that we are inheriting and inhabiting is abolition. That's the only logical response. And it's actually the one that starts to question who the we is, that is that inherits or inhabits of this moment. So this is to say then that I'm under the conviction at this moment that defining abolition in a dynamic and perpetual way might be the most important political and pedagogical act that people can embrace right now. This is especially the case because there are many people around us who have until recently been effectively anti-abolitionist, counter-abolitionist, people who have insisted on reformism, on liberal solutions, who now suddenly, because they are compelled by the actual and potential transformative violence of the moments of insurrection of 2020, have suddenly begun to call themselves abolitionists. And this is what I question about it. I'm concerned with how these self-namings are oftentimes not accompanied by the kind of rigorous studied humility that I'm trying to both privilege and maybe radically weaponize here. So on the other hand, I want to say that perhaps even more important than that is that a lot of people in adjoining communities are becoming proto-abolitionists. They're becoming abolition curious, abolition friendly. So now I think there's a renewed obligation to figure out what abolitionist praxis, method, and collective genius is and can be in dialogue with the Black radical and other intersecting and divergent political, intellectual, cultural, and aesthetic genealogies. This is to say then that abolition is not an identity. It is not something that one is or isn't. I found myself saying over and over again in concert with friends and teachers, colleagues, like Rachel Herzing, Kijana Ascari Harrison, who's still incarcerated, Ruthie Gilmore, Angela Davis, Melissa Birch, Erica Miners, Beth Ritchie, J. Cameron Carter, João Costa Vargas, Damian Sojourner, many others. Abolition is not an outcome. Abolition, I'll say it again, abolition is not an outcome. It's not a destination point. It's not an agenda or a platform. I would ask that we move from the premise that abolitionist praxis is the inheritance of a constantly changing legacy of radical and revolutionary struggle that is grounded in Black radicalism, radical Black feminism, and Black revolutionary praxis. Let us also move with the animating speculation of abolitionist struggle. Abolition is collective genius, collective creativity. It is an analytical framework. It is an organizing and activist method. Now, all these things are attempts to build the conditions of possibility for futurity, which is to say insurgent futurity, which is to say insurgent human being. Go back to my text for a minute now. The depth and normalcy of the interdisciplinary, multimedia, terror-inducing methodologies of anti-Black, racist, and colonial reaction are not mere resurgences or disruptions, but are affirmations that a script of racial progress is a counterinsurgency in our midst. In this extended counterinsurgency, there's an accompanying affirmative resistance. It is an industrialized resistance, armed with 501c3 and NGO status, and a seemingly impenetrable adherence to the protocols of the nonviolent demand. In fact, it becomes an article of generalized faith that these two methods, nonviolence and demand, are the inescapable limit practice of any feasible or effective resistance that intends to survive the generalized symbiosis of the white supremacist trinity of law, police, and racist common sense. Some will tense in rage over the sacrifice that is made, a tacit suspension of futurity for those who fit the civil enemy profile of the domestic war, the racial domestic war, the gendered racial domestic war that creeps in perpetuity. Survival is a question raised for the absolute present tense, and the edge of the insult is in the dull, insistent liberal lie that there's a future to be shared, that in fact there is a humanity within the deadly span of raciality that can ever be remotely common, familial, or universal. In my just published book, I humbly offer the notion of white reconstruction as a dense shorthand to describe this historical present. The long post-1968 half century, often referenced as the post-civil rights era in the United States, has been defined by an onslaught of consistently militarized institutional protocols and cultural significations of white life's ascendancy, assembled in response to a latter 20th century global as well as US-specific reforming of anti-Black, racist, apartheid state and cultural regimes. Yet, white reconstruction is not merely a revival of white reactionary nationalism or a refurbishing of racist state violence. Rather, as a totality of state-sponsored pedagogies, national narratives, and political performances, white reconstruction fashions itself as a broadly respectable, civilized, rights-respecting enterprise. This is in many ways an enterprise in the most racial capitalist sense of deadly entrepreneurship. White reconstruction marshals the material and imaginative capacities of state and cultural regimes to produce and normalize a sociality that is structured in gendered anti-Blackness and racial colonial violence. In this sense, we're dealing with white reconstruction as a racial political complex, a dynamic interaction of institutional protocols, jurisprudence, policy, popular and state cultural productions, and popular discourses that cohere through a relatively symbiotic, though sometimes seemingly chaotic and contentious ensemble of liberal reform. Following George Jackson's capacious definition of fascism as reform in the durable theoretical and pedagogical text, Blood in My Eye, the prima facie evidence of white reconstruction's violence is actually in the institutional inclusion and accommodation of rights and disfranchised identity claims, racial capitalist accumulation, heteropatriarchal dominance, industrialized expropriations of ecology and nature, continued occupation of territories, and criminalization of profiled bodies in targeted geographies. This racial political complex encompasses the unfolding, quaking, and convulsive reactions to the threshold of liberationist rebellions and social political transformations that defined the mid to late 20th century Western racial colonial order. From the US and global Black freedom and anti-apartheid movements to revolutionary anti-colonialist struggles and feminist and queer insurgencies everywhere. The ongoing half-century of emergence of this ensemble of transformation, reform, and reaction raises epical questions. How does the terror of gendered white supremacy, the violence of anti-Black sociality, and the civilizational order of conquest, colonialism, and militarized white occupation, including gentrification, Zionism, and settler nationalism, outlive the formal abolition of discrete state and social regimes? How do the living, collective, accumulated experiences of this terror, violence, and colonial occupation toxify as well as constitute once excluded peoples' access to rights, civil subjectivity, and other forms of political recognition within the reconstructing civilizational order? I raise these questions in an attempt to push for analytical clarity on the white demon that terrorizes our very gathering. There's a relation of violence behind and beneath the production of hegemonic social data that reflects the supervisory role of white being in the conception and production of sociality itself. This is the terror about which Sylvia Wynter famously writes. The supervisory role of man and its enactment in what I am calling white being calls for only one compulsory paradigm of sociality, the terror variously named civilization, modernity, or the first world, the coercive universalization of which makes it possible to standardize quantifications of whether and how some species groups thrive while others do not. This is another way of arguing that the social data that form the premises for the constituency, and thus of constituent power, that is, that data that is culturally produced and aestheticized by the research university, the US Census, the Center for Disease Control, and other such apparatuses, both smaller and larger, are the knowledge forms that create the quiet, though unsilent outlines for a cultural formation, that which we casually call the social. These are the artifacts of and for a narrative of the previously mentioned one compulsory paradigm of sociality. In fact, these are the expressions of the white demon, the supervisor, the thing called white being, that itself is already the condition through which the data of constituent sociality both creates and demands a narrative. This data, this narrative, this sociality set the terms for the fabled Gramscian notion of a war of position, a fable that cannot actually confront the fact of domestic policing and carceral warfare, because that fable mystifies the constitutive and perhaps the constituent limits of the debate. That is the notion that the jurisprudence, political rationales, tactics, and strategies of the domestic war can and must be resisted, navigated, and survived. But the always available fact of warfare as the cohering, deadly pageantry of sociality is somehow beyond fundamental challenge. I hope you'll allow me one more departure from my text so I can think with you about what it might mean to collectively experiment in abolitionist confrontation with warfare as sociality. I've been privileged to recently be part of an effort to abolish the police presence at all 10 University of California campuses. If you look it up in the different forms of social media, from Instagram and Twitter to Facebook, it's called UCFTP. FTP stands for whatever you want it to mean. I prefer for it to mean fuck the police. Other people mean feed the people. Other folks mean free the prisoners, so forth and so on. So it's called UCFTP, and it's this background you see behind me is the campaign. It's a Cops Off Campus campaign, and the intention of the campaign is to abolish the police presence within the end of this academic year. The collective is moving from the outcome of a serious and rigorous internal debate about whether the work we do should actually focus on campus police or not. And what we arrived at after some significant back and forth is the idea that the least we can do is abolish police presence at our campuses. That is the least we can do. The belief as well is that exemplifying police abolition at these sites, which is also to say carceral abolition at these sites, is to initiate a kind of exemplification of how different such campaigns toward abolition can and must proliferate in different institutional sites and geographies. So this is also important because if you glance at the history and genealogy of UC police presence, it's not merely a reaction to kind of overwhelmingly white anti-war student protests in the latter 60s and early 70s. It's really principally a response to Black radicalism, in particular the rise of the Black Panther Party. And it was part of the state repression of the Black Panther Party and its potentials toward revolution. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be saying fuck the police. And there's even more reasons why we should be struggling toward a bare minimum of abolishing police presence at University of California campuses. So by way of concluding my comments to you, I just wanted to note three things that have emerged in the collective mobilization, analysis, research, and public pedagogy of this Cops Off Campus police abolition campaign. And this is kind of both critical insight, but it's also something that I've been generating with the people that I'm doing this work with. The first thing is the fact that police terror, I'll say it again, police terror, as distinguished from police brutality or even police violence. Police terror is a key concept that remains underarticulated in most reflections on the ongoing revolts of 2020. And for that matter, well prior to 2020, right? But I'm just privileging 2020 because of where we're sitting right now. Terror, as soon as we begin to engage with it in a serious way, it quickly becomes clear to anybody who is paying serious attention that terror is not something that one reforms. That's first. And maybe second, at the risk of seeming overly simplistic, but I'm not sure that I am being overly simplistic when I say this, is that police terror and terror generally, but police terror in particular, seems to divide the world into those who are terrorized, those who inflict the terror, and those who feel protected by the institutionalization of terror. So engaging with this idea of police terror, I think, is a really critical thing that I would argue yields itself to other forms of consideration that I think are compatible with destituent power. The second thing that's emerged, there's a clear imperative to embrace as a bare minimum condition of struggle the notion of collective self-defense as an everyday obligation, right? I mean, this tends to be something that one would hope would be proliferated common sense when the president of the United States is actually urging right-wing reactionary armed militia groups to stand by, right? But I'm not sure that it has. I'm not sure that there is a robust or remotely adequate discussion of what self-defense is and should be at this moment. And there's not nearly enough of a kind of scholarly activist reflection on the tradition of self-defense that come from different criminalized and repressed and colonized and chattelized communities. So when I say self-defense, I'm obviously as well talking about networks of accountability and protection. And of course, I'm also talking about armed forms of self-defense, right? And I'm also thinking robustly about the idea of self-defense. So that's the second thing that's come up in relation to police violence, police terror, and police abolition. The third thing is I've already begun to invoke is the fact that counterinsurgency is assuming many forms, including the disciplining and liberal rearticulation of abolitionist, proto-abolitionist, and destituent forms of collective power, community, and praxis, into reformist invitations to protect white being and its singular, compulsory, genocidal sociality, right? We have to be constantly aware of how counterinsurgency is on the make. It is happening all around us. And I would argue that the sites of the academy are one of the principal generative sites of counterinsurgency, especially as it takes a kind of radical or neo-radical or pseudo-radical or pseudo-abolitionist kind of appearance. I'll finish with a final very short passage from this manuscript I'm trying to finish. We search for a retelling, a way to hold them accountable for the things in time unforgotten, even as memory melts into an urgency of now. America of allegiance is war. Their story does not hide this. It celebrates in the child's hand on beating heart, on teacher's cue, flag unfurled. With open silence, some abide the suffocating intimacy implied by the celebration of dominance, knowing they are its implied targets. The suffering is not the byproduct of hate, it is the way things are. In war, there are declarations of status, enemies, allies, suspects, victims, soldiers, victories. Sometimes they do not call it war. They simply make endless declarations. There's confusion of a kind that ticks as if the end of days, the apocalypse is no longer near, it is here, if we allow ourselves to tell the other story. is the work of narrating the onset of obsolescence. There must be another way to tell the story. They want to push the glory of closure, but too much has been undone. Thank you all for listening.
Wonderful, man. This is just a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Dylan. I couldn't write fast enough for all of you. This is just a wonderful conversation. I want to take maybe, you know, I'm thinking maybe 15, 20 minutes. We might go longer, I don't know, but at least we can start there, 15 or 20 minutes, and just see if we can have some intra-panel discussion. There are a lot of resonances across different papers, some tensions here and there, and some interesting, like, well, I guess this falls under resonances, but some interesting couplets of themes coming across a number of the papers and the general reflections. I myself just quickly just noted, going backwards from the more recent papers to the earlier ones, I think that there's an interesting kind of conversation to be had around what Dylan wonderfully and powerfully theorized with respect to abolition, and actually Megan's paper, the penultimate paper before Dylan, talking about care. There's a sense in which I want to hear what Dylan was talking about as a kind of abolitionist care. An abolitionist sociality of care that I think again resonates in some interesting ways with what Megan was theorizing. And then another panelist talked about the imaginal that I think is well worth considering in this context as well. We've heard about biophysics, the virality of revolt and the revolt of the virus, and how these offer perhaps alternative kind of like paradigms of, in their own right, sociality. And then as well, the theme that came up in the last paper as well about the imperative to retell, the imperative to tell another story, which has, I'm going to venture to speculate, has a kind of also Sylvia Wynter tone to it about homo narrans, to tell other stories. I would just sort of just want to just open it up. Those are just things that, you know, I was able to write down really, really quickly amongst these reams of pages of notes that I've recorded for myself. And I'll also just throw one other thing out here. I do think that there's an undercurrent, though it wasn't explicit. It was on the verge of being explicit in some of the papers, but I think there's an undercurrent for questions of religion inside these conversations that are happening here. Though it is, shall we say, religion in another key, perhaps religion of a para-religious sort, but nevertheless, some other kind of, I think that there's a space for asking questions about a kind of discourse of a certain kind of religious insurgency across these papers dealing with destituent power or destituent potentiality on the one hand, and abolitionism, abolitionist sociality on the other. Okay, with that said, I'm gonna like take a little bit of a back seat, and I'm interested in you all just jumping in and going for it. So we just gonna be quiet. That's how we gonna do this. I will throw a teaser out there and invite particularly the Avalanche Collective to say a little bit more for me, because I was absolutely intrigued by the way in which you two were just working around biophysics and in thinking at the kind of biological kind of level of virality, and drawing out a kind of both destituent and undercommons politics of sociality through that. I would just love to hear a bit more of an elaboration of that, mainly because some of the concepts were just very, very new to me, and what I was catching, I was really, really liking.
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question with maybe tying back links to some of the stuff that I heard in the other panelist talks. That might give like maybe more depth to what we're trying to say. So Dylan, like you brought up epigenetics, like sort of in the beginning of your talk. And I guess like we sort of constructed the genome as something that is historically thought of as like a barcode for the self. It's something that constitutes the self in this very particular way. And so we are thinking about the virus as like inserting these like corruptible sequences within genomes that slowly integrate to like affect the constituted body and increase its capacities in all of these spectral ways that don't make themselves immediately obvious. And so that sort of concept of epigenetics kind of like almost unveils like a whole new mechanism by which that this can take place, because epigenetics is like the landscape on top of genes. It's like not just the genes you have, but how they all are regulated. And so I think that ties in with this like sort of question of destitution and virality as well. And then the other sort of themes that I heard is like Luhuna talked about like sort of like a frozen subjectivity that exists in like this like arrested space-time of the metropolis under quarantine. And Megan talked about like how these temporalities kind of have to flow and intersect with each other to create like new forms of being. And I think that really ties into sort of the spatiotemporal question that viruses bring up, where like the virus is everywhere, but it's like invisible, and it like connects all of these different temporalities from like the very immediate and like urgent to these like really long time scales where it's like integrated within the body. So it's like flows not just through the body, but also across time. Create like latent capacities that can like unfreeze ourselves in moments where like the vector for escape presents itself.
Yeah.
I would just say, in addition to that, kind of like, what we're trying to get at is figure out a new way of, or a new kind of knowledge that can be extracted from this virus. And again, like we pointed to some of the failures of the more popular responses, especially in the US, as pointed out, maybe our framework is a little bit too US centered, but I think like, as we see the sort of uprisings all over the world unfold, they are potent, but they do come crashing up against a lack of figures for how to make revolution or what that means. In the traditional 20th century term of revolution, if we're talking about like, there's some sort of force that takes power and reorganizes society in a new way. This like seems no longer possible, precisely because of like the ecological devastation and the risks to life on Earth itself. And so what virality is an attempt to think is how these other sort of life forms that insert themselves into our situation can perhaps like guide us, or that we can take note of them, form some sort of like an unholy alliance with them in order to help us move through the sort of devastation, sickness, all of this stuff that we're living through right now.
Thank you. And the another question that I had about this, I'm still with the Avalanche Collective. By the way, I just love this name, the Avalanche Collective. If you could maybe say a bit more about the slow dimension, I think you called it the lysogenic, and the kind of the fast dimension, the lytic, I believe, of how the virus works, right? And this kind of fracturing of time, at once slow and also sped up, in you know, like kind of simultaneity in that respect, if I'm understanding right. At once fast, at once slow.
Right. So the reason we use this as an example is because I think Luhuna's talk did a really good job of explaining, like, what are we supposed to be doing in times when it seems like there's nothing happening? And, you know, it's like there's, I think a lot of the efforts that we see to build autonomy or mutual aid in the moment, especially with regards to healthcare, they can seem almost entirely insufficient, right? It's like, okay, what are you going to do? Like, you know, you can't build a decentralized hospital. That it doesn't really work like that. But what we wanted to point to is that it's like a sort of silent reconstitution, that once moments of rupture happen, serve as sort of like lightning rods for the reconstitution of society or social relations.
So is it almost like the moment of the virus is also like the kind of it's almost like the instance where an event can like sort of take place. Right.
Yeah,
I'm trying to think that with, you know, some of the other talks that were happening as well.
Yeah, so the silent reconstitution that June referred to is, yeah, it's like basically inserting this like set of instructions for how we might function differently. And so to sort of ground it more in like real examples, it's like we're sort of thinking of Diane de Primo's poems, one of which says like the revolutionary must always undo themselves. And so like what is like the corruptible element within us? How can we ask ourselves during moments of latency, how are we undoing like our own subjectivities? And in doing so, like basically seed a set of instructions that can activate. And so that's like sort of the lysogenic phase. And then this lytic phase is this moment where like the rupture actually cannot be contained, and you think it's impossible until it's happening, and you're in it, you know. And so it's like it's almost it feels ahistorical, or it feels like rupture, but there is like a thread of continuity that is like that has been shaped before, and that this like the way to sort of think about the lytic phase is not as something that we're just waiting to happen, but rather as something that is subject to all sorts of noise. It's just subject to like, it's going to surprise itself. It's subject to like consensus and the statistics that come with sort of like a population level emergent collective behavior. And so rather than trying to like overdetermine or overcode those moments, we can just like basically transform moments of social peace into like a different type of activity that is creating like temporalities that are bigger than just that lag phase, you know?
I see.
I would say is like before the George Floyd rebellion happened, I was thinking like, I was looking at all the uprisings happening all over the world, as I'm sure many of us were, and it was obvious that at some point it was going to happen in the US. It was only a matter of time, but we don't know when. And so the idea is like, when this happens, what tools will already need to be in place so that when this event happens, we're ready to go. We have formulas. We've looked at mechanisms from all over the world that people have used. Hong Kong was a really big influence on me. And so looking at these organizational models and trying to seed them silently into our everyday life so that they're in place for a moment of rupture when it happens. And I think that is more than anything, like what the sort of importance of building autonomy is not that it's not that it just provides a band-aid to state like where the state fails, but that it serves as like a contact point that is set to explode, and it can serve as like a conduit for new social relations when the order breaks down.
Yeah.
Okay.
When it laterally creates these connectivities, like in a viral sense.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to go to Gerardo, if I'm pronouncing your name right. I know that you wanted to ask Dylan a question, but before doing so, can I ask you? This is a question that comes on behalf of Nicole. Nicole wanted to know if you would just take a moment and maybe just sort of like maybe summarize what you were saying, the big point that you were driving at. She just wanted you to just clarify that to make sure she got basically the general arc of where you were going with that. And then you can come out of that and then please engage Dylan.
The point just in general, if I could reduce it to just one single element, I would just say that it seems to me, you know, if we are to think about the problem of form of life, right, which Agamben, Tikkun, the Invisible Committee, Marcello Tari, and other people have tried to advance, right, against the grain of political subjectivity and the reduction of the subject, insofar as the concept of the subject, right, is at the end of the day a final dispensation of humanism, right, of Western humanism. Then we have to think the relationship between form and event. No, more or less that was the vortex of my argument. And I would say that today the crisis of the world is a crisis of event, right? A crisis of the contingency, right, of the outside that the human experience lacks fundamentally. And that is why that I would say, right, that there might be two registers at play in this panel. Perhaps it could also happen in other panels, right? Which is, I think, a very solid and important discussion at the level of sociology, at the level of facts, and there is another discussion that takes place at the level of critical metaphysics. Now, I'm not saying that one should value one or the other, but I'm just saying that there is two different levels here, right? And my take was more on the critical metaphysics.
And may I just jump in just on this very point, because one of the things I found really interesting about your talk, about the way in which you sort of like laid out, you know, and give some sort of descriptions, shall we say, of the event. And you use the language of a new stylization of life and the importance of the category of style. Let me see, I'm going through my notes here. How style in some sense is a kind of breaking through from the imprisonment of form or something. Would you just say a bit about that? Because I find that really, really interesting. I almost want to ask you to like comment on that at the level of maybe even the example of the poem, right? As the poem as a potential, a kind of aesthetic moment that breaks through form, right? Even as it operates in some respect in relationship to form, right? So that such that the poem becomes a moment of the event, or at least particular certain kinds of poems. I'm thinking in a more experimental register.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Jay, because if I could refer just to an obvious example, you know, Agamben has an implicit theory of the event, and another one that is more explicit, you know. The explicit theory, I think it has to do with the messianic moment, right? Mm-hmm. But a more, and I think more productive theory of the event happens precisely at the level of language and the poem, you know. So when he analyzes poetry and talks about the figure, not the figure, yeah, the rhetorical figure of the enjambment, right? Encabalgamiento, which is the sort of musical and rhythmic cut, right, of a verse as it runs through another verse, right? That creates a singular style that doesn't really coincide with form, but it is within form, right? So you could have a sonnet, or you could have a decima, right? A short popular poem in the Spanish tradition, right? And this cut generates sort of its own movement in the process, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this connects very, very neatly too with what Megan was proposing in the as it relates to what you call the flow or the Chinese model, right, of understanding a certain correlation with necessity at the end of the day, you know. So I think that style is, at the end of the day, something like a appropriation of the improper, right? That is included in form, but it's not reducible to it. No?
Yes, yes.
More or less, it's like that. I don't know if I'm fully answering your question. No.
No. You exactly are, and it is related to this question of religion that I'm talking about, because so there's this thinker that I've been thinking with a lot lately named Charles Long, and Charles Long he gives a theory of Black religion. And the key thing of what he does is he argues that if you want to understand the specific Blackness of Black religion, you have to think about the insurrection of style. And the insurrection of style is the ways in which Blackness in its informality, /formality, breaks into the formation of the racial world vis-a-vis religion by cutting against religion. And that cut is, he says it's style. He also calls it counter creation. It's not creation, it's a counter creation, right? A kind of deformation of the very operation of creation that, you know, sort of enacts a kind of counter creation. What we are here calling, I think, the event.
Exactly.
But for him, it's style, and the Blackness of Black religion is stylistic in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I would say, I mean, here I'm no specialist, but I remember reading, for instance, a very beautiful essay by Chandler on jazz music, and I think that's another important instance, right, where he talks about the double movement or the double time, right? It's an stylistic pattern of repetition in jazz that creates a style, but is outside form or is formless. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. But please engage Dylan. You were saying you want to have a question with him.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate, and I learned a lot from Dylan's intervention. And I wanted to ask a question more from the point of view of an outsider of your work. I will start reading your book soon, but about abolition. And you mentioned the necessity of getting rid of the police on campus, right? And in the Latin American experience or debate, Latin Americanism, especially the Chilean scene, which is very productive intellectually, there have been a discussion about the status and the condition of the university. Because the university in 1990 was a very important cultural apparatus to reproduce the dictatorship by other means. So in a certain sense, the university was in itself sort of a carceral form that it was in a way a form of a police apparatus, but in its very distribution of disciplines and categorical arrangements. And so the question is, where does abolition stand? Because it's a discussion that I don't see too much in the United States, at least, right? But that may be just my ignorance. Where does abolition start in relation to the university? Because it seems to me that one question is, right, to get rid of the police from campus, and another position would be to say that the very organization of knowledge in the university today is obsolete and we need to destroy the university, or at least separate the university from thinking.
Brilliant question. And part of what I'll say is that there's this emergent critical discourse that's being fueled by folks like Nicholas Mitchell, UC Santa Cruz, by Abby Boggs, by others, called Abolitionist University Studies, that undertakes the very question that you have posed. So they actually organized a gathering about a year ago that maybe some of the folks in attendance here know about, or maybe even participated in. But it moves from that analytical framework, which is my translation of it for my own praxis, is to say this. Part of the reason why you have to pose that question is because of the mystification that there is a distinction between the university and policing. And I don't mean the police, I'm talking about policing as power, right? And one of the principal ways that one can demystify that distinction between the university and policing power is to simply look at the how the hierarchical bureaucracy of university police actually operate. At most universities, the police department and the police chief have a direct report to a university administrator, which is to then say that there's actually no formal distinction between the police and the university administration, right? That they're actually one and the same thing. That in the bureaucratic sense, university police are actually literally taking orders as they report to university administration. So they're part of a continuum of power, right? And then it's to also magnify the point that you're making in the question, which is to say that the university is already premised on carceral power. It's already premised on this totality of police power that includes epistemic policing, really epistemic cultural genocide in a sense that exceeds the formal definitions of genocide, right? So I think part of what I'm interested in getting at in different sites, in different settings, in different localities, not significantly beyond the United States, I should say, right? Is to apprehend what folks in other places have already analyzed, because they have to analyze it this way, which is that the university is actually inseparable. Not only is it inseparable, it is actually constitutive of these forms of genocidal and violent power, right? That they're actually and they're constitutive of it, not merely in the sense of being the kind of think tanks through which strategies and technologies develop, but that universities actually exemplify this form of power, right? They model it. In many ways, these universities are a kind of testing ground for new forms of policing and new policing techniques, strategies, and discourses that then are carried forward by the state and extra state institutions, regimes, and so forth. So anyway, that's the start of an answer, but I think we could have a much longer conversation about it. But I really appreciate that question.
Fantastic. Listen, I want to throw out another. I'm gonna throw out two at the same time, just in the interest of time, and I want to try and get through as many of these questions that are really great that I see here. One is directed towards Megan, and then another is directed towards, I'm forgetting who was it that talked about the imaginal. Let me get my names right. Rodrigo. So I'll start with Megan first. There's a question here that is inviting you to elaborate on fugitivity or fugitive planning, fugitivity and planning responses to chronic illness. Just to kind of like, give us a bit more of what you're driving at with that. And the other is, I'll just throw the two out at the same time, is to Rodrigo. There's a question inviting you to elaborate a bit on the imaginal, which is also something I would love to hear more about as well.
Okay, hi.
Mm-hmm.
I'm bad at these discussions, so sorry. But yeah, so in terms of elaborating that, I would just say that I think a lot about fugitive planning from the time of illness is the way that people have to negotiate, like, okay, if I take this medication, this is not my ultimate goal, but I'm going to take this medication for this long so that I can build these connections while I'm taking this to this level of health to get out of this place. Like, I don't know, I think a lot in those terms. And I also think a lot in terms of like the different different body like apparatuses I use. Like I keep an enormous, like I keep like a real like log of all of the objects that I need and what I have. And whenever I'm making decisions about how to like move forward through a certain like issue with illness, I'm always looking for relations and connections that help me build toward the next thing that I need. So it's always like this interplay between like knowing what you have, knowing what you need, and building out of it, and building toward the relations that can help you build out of it too. So I don't know, that's not if I had some more time to think on it, I could have a better answer, but simply that's it. Yeah. But
before we go to Rodrigo, if you don't mind, I want to invite you to maybe connect up some of the things, Megan, you were talking about with this really curious and wonderful line that you provided in your bio to me that I read out. In it, you say that your work explored the relationship between settler colonialism and real estate finance, focusing on derivative technologies as divinatory force, right? Because I take it that part of what you've described in this paper is almost like a kind of counter-divinatory practice, right? Which makes me like think about the way in which the notion of divinatory practice is this collective practice in that Cedric Robinson actually talks about in some of his work, right? The divinity of the masses, right? So it's a counter-divinatory practice that I think you were elaborating, but again, I'm like kind of inserting the connection between what I think I hear you saying and that there, and almost suggesting perhaps that between this meditation around destituent power and potentiality on the one hand, and Black radical abolitionist practice on the other, these are at least modes of counter-divinatory practice that are kind of like in the context of this conference talking to each other.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that actually reminds me of something that I wanted to mention also in terms of this question of thinking revolution today. Because, okay, so Pierre Monetary, I think I'm probably butchering the name, but his work, he has this one book called Dominus Mundi, which is a like demonological reading of sovereignty. And his work is really interesting because it goes back, like, it kind of allows you to think about the racial relation as the relation of the sovereign against anyone divining otherwise. So sovereign power as divinatory, and anyone divining otherwise as demon, to be disposed of in whatever way. You can see how this relation moves throughout time.
Who is this scholar?
Pierre Monetary. The book is called Dominus Mundi. He's a Italian legal scholar.
Okay.
And so when we're thinking about like capitalism today and what we mean by the sovereign subject or sovereign citizen or popular sovereignty in the US, we have to like also think back to where we got this from. And okay, quick and dirty monetary history. In 1571, the Royal Exchange in England, for the first time, the Royal Exchange was created and the king borrows from the subjects. And out of this, we start having this interplay of currency where the sovereign, now there's a sovereign subject, and it's done through this like currency relation. The subjects are brought into the sovereign's currency. And with the establishment of the US dollar as the reserve currency after World War II for global finance, we have, I don't know, this kind of global subject being tied to that monetary system in a way. And what we saw as this real rupture with that in 2008 was the beginning of these different types of, I'm gonna blank on the name, what the Federal Reserve, when they're putting money in to stock markets, derivatives markets, oh my gosh, what's the name? Anyways, it'll come to me in a second, but this was actually like an exception. This was a break from the system. And it's also, no, not bailouts, quantitative easing. Thank you. Yes, quantitative easing. So with the beginning of quantitative easing, we really have this economy that's set up in order to, you know, keep this motion of the subject moving. But then with quantitative easing, we have the government starting to like just divine on its own, just put money in and divine the future that way. And through that, and this can be thought of with the derivatives market. So the derivatives are a bet on a future price of an item. And in this betting, and this is what my dissertation is about how this betting is actually a divinatory technology.
Wow.
And so,
Man, that's not,
and so thinking about this, but also thinking this break that's happening now, I really, like, I'm not sure what it means to resist that other than to figure out these counter divinatory practices.
yeah, it's kind of what Dylan was saying.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
End, right? You got to tell different stories, right?
Yeah.
It's that homo narrans piece. You got, because the divinatory operation is a certain kind of theopolitical storytelling. And to break that, you tell another story, right? You narrate otherwise, or what Winter will call, you know, we have to tell different stories about ourselves, auto-institute ourselves. And she even invokes the notion of that practice of auto-institution, of telling different stories, is a myth practice, right?
Yeah.
It's a counter, you know, what Spillers would call the counter myth.
Yeah, exactly. But the where this comes to the question of revolution today is we have all of these, like, everyone is like red flags, it's about to collapse. Like if we get the US out of COVID, then like saving the economy is getting way more complicated. These technologies are not meant to be used long term. So what we're seeing really is either like the emergence of a new level of collapse, or we're going to see like a Chinese reserve currency or this new type of technology becoming the norm on a global level. And so I don't know what it means to think revolution in terms of that is a different,
I see.
It's a different question for me. And it has to be, I think, some sort of counter divinatory practice, which is also like material. It's bringing materials into like another world, another form of exchange.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. That's very helpful. Rodrigo, did you want to jump in and say something about the imaginal?
Yeah, maybe I can establish a little relation between this answer to the a little commentary about Geraldo's thing said, and another question that make Kieran about the difference between revolution and revolt in the Fourierist thought. No, I think there are three levels. Maybe I think the first thing is that we don't have. I am trying to not confuse the imaginal with the imaginary. Okay, imaginary is also the concept that uses Lacan maybe or Castoriadis, you know. But for me, an imaginary is just a frozen image, you know, and the confiscation of the transformation force of the imaginal. The imaginal is maybe a sensible medium that is capable to transform the material and immaterial, no? And the immaterial in material. Maybe we can think about the nociology of Averroes, where between the imagination, no, we transform the things of the world in forms to think, no, in abstract forms to think. So the imaginal is the path to connect our singular bodies to the common sense. So it's a medium, but it's not only a human medium, but the relationship to our outside, to the human between the non-human. No? That's why the comparison between revolts and viruses has some sense for me, because the imaginal is that force of transformation, and it's very important what the discussion about that posit Kieran and also Gerardo and Dylan about the police and university, because or form an event. We could think that the medium form event is the imaginal. The imaginal, no, is the way that some form, no, goes to a rhythm, and in the other way, a rhythm crystallizes or singularizes in some form. But the problem I see in I'm following the comment of Gerardo. The problem I see is that the event we are devastating the event in this sense, because we have forms without the imaginal potentiality of transformation. So revolt is an imaginal, that destitute forms, and that forms the state, the political order, I don't know, don't have, they only have imaginary, but not the medium that mixes all the living things, I think. I'm trying to think like the interpretation that provides Emanuele Coccia by the one side, but trying to drive Emanuele Coccia to think another time the problem of politics, and the most precisely the problem of experience, political experience, not only politics in the Soren way of the terminology. So I would say three things that I maybe are important. The first is the problem of form and rhythm. No, rhythm is the pulse of any revolt. No? Any revolt is just like a rhythm. No, but no, the difference in Furiesi between revolution and revolt is that, well, as you know, a revolution, said Furiesi, is the moment when we inaugurate another time. No? So we restitute the chronological time. No? So instead of a revolt that consists on the suspension of time. The revolt suspension is the suspension of time, and revolution is the restitute of chronological time, I think. That's the difference in Furiesi. That difference is metaphysical in terms of metaphysical point of view, the same difference between rhythm and form. No? Revolution is just like the form, no? And revolt is the rhythm. And in the third level, no? University is a conflict between rhythm and form. And in Latin America, it's very interesting that in university, no, the studying of humanities has a political place in the structure of the state, because humanities are the dispositive, if we can think about on Michel Foucault terminology, humanities were the dispositive between the one the citizens can talk in each other with one only grammatical terms or grammatical norms. No? Humanities posit the common norms to which what do you think, what is a citizen and what is not a citizen. No? An Indian, for example, no? Something that Megan talked about this. No? The problem, the colonial problem, is a university problem. Is the university problem, you know? Because in university problem, we have the tension between form and rhythm. No? That's why in the in the University of Paris in the 13th century, in the 13th century, the university arises with a general strike, between students and professors, because university have inside the tension between form and rhythm, that maybe is the one that pushes the distinction in Furiesi between revolution and revolt. But this is very important because Kiran quote this and asked to us, is revolution dead? So, is revolution dead? No. Well, I think not. But there's a model of revolution that is dead, and that model of revolution has its paradigm in the French Revolution, with a historical philosophy concept, with a vanguard concept, with a scope that want to take the power of the state. I think, for example, the experience of the Arab Spring, for many scholars in politology, the Arab Spring has been thinking from the revolutionary paradigm. So if you see the Arab Spring or any revolt from the revolutionary paradigm, none of that revolts can be understand. So I think we have to make the other point of view. We have to take the other point of view. Do not see the form, do not see the rhythm by the paradigm of the form, but the form by the paradigm of the rhythm. So we have to make, we have to see the revolution since the paradigm of the revolt. So that is very important, but because maybe that is a way in which we not only can replace the politics, but also the experience inside politics, like the outside of the politics, that go contemporary in any way. So, well, excuse for my English, but I'm trying to think, like the jazz, like the jazz.
Thank you very much. No, that was quite helpful. Thank you very much. I mean, the imaginal. I asked that, and I, caught the reference to Henri Carvalho as well. Is actually very, very interesting, and it's got a number of kind of like
just a little thing, Kameron. I'm trying to think the imaginal as a force of transformation, a sensible medium, but a force of transformation. In all the philosophical tradition, you think imagination as a faculty of representation. I think we have to leave imagination as a faculty of representation and take the imagination as a force of transformation. But we have to be clear in this point. Imagination is not a human faculty. Imagination is the force that traverses, I don't know how you say atraviesa, Gerardo. Traverse all the living things, I think. So in a way that the rhythm and the form can not reconcile, but destitute, no, destitute the forms, no, and open and for another forms of life.
Yeah. No, that's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. I'm tempted to keep going, but I got to stop because we're over time. But this issue of the imaginal is actually is quite important. It's sort of like what makes every form not formally close in on itself, right? But renders them open to, I would say, a deformation, which is like a kind of generative flowering or something like that. But anyway, we gotta land the plane with that because we're over time. This has been a wonderful, wonderful panel. I've learned so much from each of you, and the conversation was just like another gift on top of all of that. So thank you all very much, and thank you for the audience for hanging in there with us and hearing these just wonderful reflections on from the first panel of this Destituent Power Undercommons conversation, and his first panel on the virus and the uprisings. I want to thank every one of you. I'm full with appreciation for all that you've done and all that you've allowed me and opened up for me to think, and I'm sure our listeners as well. As we land this plane for the evening, I want to just let you know that tomorrow, I'm looking at some of the notes that are coming across here. My understanding is that there's going to be a video of our conversation at some point soon. I suppose more information on that will be coming soon, but we can expect a video of the conversation, the paper presentations and the conversation. And I also want to let everyone know that panel 2 will take place tomorrow at 1 p.m. I believe that the title, let me scroll back up here. I believe that the title of the conversation tomorrow is, I can tell you let me find the name. Oh, here it is. It's called Anti-Politics, not anti, but anti-politics, A-N-T-E. The subtitle is Self-Defense of the Surround. It's going to be facilitated by my colleague and wonderful friend on the faculty here at IU in the English department, the poet Ross Gay. He will be facilitating the conversation. The panelists will be Marquise Bay, Stefano Harney, Fred Moten, Idris Robinson, Vitalist International, and poetry by Billy Ray Belcourt. I don't know if y'all know of Billy Ray Belcourt's poetry, but I mean, it's mesmerizing. It's amazing. So it's gonna be amazing tomorrow. So I hope to see you or meet up with you tomorrow virtually at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 1 to 4 p.m. Looking forward to panel 2. Thank you once again to all of the panelists. I truly appreciate you all.
Jay, thank you for facilitating and leading us through.
Listen, my job was easy. It's just, working with you all. I'm grateful, but thank you very much. I appreciate that. Until tomorrow, be well, be safe, and let's work towards the revolution. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.